Chapters 57 and 58 of Taken at the Flood, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 57. Ah, love, my hope is swooning in my heart. Sylvia and her belongings landed at Antwerp early in the morning after they left St. Catherine's Wharf. Celine, the French maid, was quite in her element amidst all the bustle and confusion of the quay, since many of those jabbering tongues which made a babel around the travellers jabbered in French. But poor Mrs. Stringfold gazed about her in helpless amazement, as much alarmed as if she had found herself amidst a tribe of North American Indians or the dark aborigines of Central Africa. "I never could abide foreigners," she muttered to herself, since there was none other to whom she could confide her emotions. "And to live among them must be awful, not knowing what one's eating or drinking, or if the natives mayn't be laying a plan to murder one. I'm sure they all look like it." Lady Perriam made short work of the ordeal with the Custom House officials, who glanced with an indulgent eye at the portmanteau of so liberal a lady, and then had her child, and nurse, and maid put into a coach and whisked off to the Hotel St. Antoine. She did not think it advisable to put up at the hotel where Mr. Standen was staying. She chose her rooms, a bedroom for Stringfold and the child opening out of hers, a saloon with 3 windows, gorgeous with crimson velvet and looking-glass, altogether a princely suite of apartments. But this splendor evoked no admiration from Mrs. Stringfold. "The rooms are handsome enough," she said to Celine, who happily understood English, "but they're not homely. I feel a something wanting in them." Breakfast was served for my lady in the solitary grandeur of the saloon. Stringfold and Celine took their refection in a smaller apartment which did duty for day nursery. Stringfold brightened a little at sight of a beefsteak and fried potatoes, which she confessed was more unsophisticated than she could have expected from foreign cooks. "But I shouldn't wonder if it was horseflesh, for all that," she added dubiously. Horseflesh or oxflesh, however, Stringfold ate, and with an appetite. She had been prostrated with seasickness during the passage, and her inside, as she informed Celine, was nothing but emptiness. Lady Perriam's breakfast was a briefer business. She ate a morsel of roll, drank a cup of coffee, and then made her toilette before going to the Hotel Peter Paul in quest of Edmund Standen. She was feverishly impatient for their meeting, fearing lest some evil hazard should prevent it. He might have left Antwerp without waiting for a reply to his letter. Swiftly as she had hastened to answer his question with her own lips, she might be too late. Fate had been against them heretofore. "How haggard I look!" she thought, as she put on her bonnet before the strange looking glass. Strange mirrors are no flatterers. They are apt to give a green and sickly hue to the human countenance, like that despondent view of life which obtains in some minds. Lady Perriam's deep mourning intensified the pallor of her tired face. The hazel eyes had a heavy look. It was still perfect beauty, but not the fresh young loveliness that had smiled upon Edmund Standen in the half light under the chestnut tree. "Love will make me beautiful again when I am with him," she said to herself. She ordered a fly and drove off to the Hotel Peter Paul, a large and somewhat gloomy-looking hostelry, not far from the famous Rubens House, which travellers go to see. Here she asked for Mr. Standen. Yes, there was an English monsieur of that name in the hotel. He was at that moment writing his letters in a private room. Would Madame desire that he should be summoned, or would she go to his apartment? Madame said she would go to his apartment. The waiter led her up a slippery staircase to a room on the first floor, a room fronting the big empty square which wakes into spasmodic life only on market days. How Sylvia's heart beat as she followed the man up the stairs, along the corridor, till he tapped at one of the tall doors, to which tap came the brief answer in a voice she knew. "Entrez." It was not the waiter, but Sylvia, who entered. Edmund was writing at a table near a window, with his back to the door, and did not even look round or lift his head, expecting no one but the waiter. Sylvia went close to his chair and touched him lightly on the shoulder. At that light touch he started to his feet, saw the lovely face looking at him pleadingly, and clasped her in his arms. "Sylvia, is this your answer?" he cried rapturously. Forgotten his dishonour, his broken promise, his mother's wrath, Esther's sorrow, all forgotten in that exquisite bliss. "What other answer would you have?" she asked half reproachfully, looking up at him with tear-dimmed eyes. "Haven't I told you that I never ceased to love you? What better answer could you expect to the most foolish question that was ever asked? I am yours, Edmund, yours to the end of life. Why did you run away from me? I did not run away from you, but from my own disgrace. I have behaved like a scoundrel. I execrate myself for my folly in ever believing that I could forget you, or live without you." "Yes, that was a mistake, certainly," replied Sylvia with a serene smile. She felt now that the world was her own. Cleopatra, with Antony at her feet, could not have felt a more complete sense of sovereignty, or a greater contempt for Octavia, than Sylvia felt for Miss Rochdale. "A mistake that caused pain to another," said Edmund self-accusingly. For him, conscience would never be silent, not even at this supreme hour, when he had Sylvia's bright brown head lying on his breast, Sylvia's eyes looking up at him, radiant with triumphant love. "Bah! It was Miss Rochdale's own fault if she was deceived. She knew how fond you had been of me 2 years ago. She should have known that you had no heart to give her." "She believed in my honesty of purpose, Sylvia. She did me the honor to trust my word, only to discover that I had lied to her. She will never know that I lied to myself as well." "Go back to your Miss Rochdale," cried Sylvia, snatching herself from his arms. "It is clear you care more for her than for me." "You know I do not, Sylvia. You know that I tried to care for her, tried to set her in your vacant place, to look forward hopefully to a future shared with her. But I could not. Your spell held me too strongly." "Did it?" cried Sylvia. "I'm glad of that. Do you believe in the power of one mind over another? I do. Often and often in those slow, wretched days at Perium, after Sir Aubrey's death, when I hoped you would come to see me and you did not come, I used to fold my arms upon my breast and close my eyes, and try to send my will to rule yours. 'Edmund, come to me,' I used to say. 'Edmund, be true to me. Edmund, I love you. Give me love for love.' Did the charm work?" "It did," he answered, clasping her to his heart again. They were lovers once more, betrothed, all in all to each other, standing alone in their own narrow world, as in the old days under the chestnut tree. "The charm did work, Sylvia, but it was the old charm, the same spell which bound me that spring day when I saw you first in Hedingham Church. I was never released from that sweet thraldom. I only fancied myself free." "You are my prisoner for evermore," said Sylvia, clasping her arms lightly round her lover's neck as he bent his head towards her. "And now, Edmund, let us talk of the future," she went on, releasing him from that gentle bondage, and seating herself by the open window, below which lay the sleepy old square, white in the noontide sun. "There is no fear of poverty now, no terror of a stern parent disinheriting us." "No," said Edmund rather moodily. "You are rich enough." "And you are poor, poor for my sake, and you scorn to owe wealth to me. Is that it, Edmund? I made myself disagreeable once because there seemed a chance of your being poor, and now you are going to make yourself disagreeable because I am rich." "No, Sylvia, I am too happy to be disagreeable. What welcome can I give you glad enough, my brave girl, for having come to your lover? We will care nothing for any world but our own world, and if other people despise your husband, you will never scorn him, will you, Sylvia?" "Scorn you?" she echoed. "You know I have always considered you the best and noblest of men. Yes, even when I treated you so hardly." "We will forget all past sorrows, Sylvia. And now tell me how you came here. I have been too surprised and too happy to ask the question any sooner. How did you come to Antwerp? Not alone?" "No, not alone." "Your mother, perhaps, came with you. The mother for whom you sacrificed yourself. She has need to be fond of you and to cling to you." Sylvia looked embarrassed. "No," she said. "My mother is not with me." Was he going to use his right as her betrothed lover and ask all manner of awkward questions? She looked away from him uneasily, looked down at the broad sunlit place, with eyes that hardly saw the tall white houses, with their quaint gables and shining windows, and little mirrors stuck out to catch the rare reflection of vehicle or pedestrian. "Where is she, then, darling? She should have been with you at such a time as this. Does she doubt my friendship for her? My Sylvia's mother would be sacred in my mind. She has endured so much sorrow and shrinks from strangers. By and by, of course, it will be different. She is staying near London with old friends. You need not trouble yourself about her, Edmund. She is amply provided for." "I have no doubt of that. But you said you did not come to Antwerp alone." "I had my son and his nurse with me. My own maid as well." She saw the little shiver he gave at the mention of her son, an involuntary expression of that lurking jealousy with which he had ever regarded the heir of Perium. Here was a claimant for Sylvia's love who could never be thrust aside; whose claim would strengthen and widen year by year, till by and by her natural pride in her first-born might make her almost indifferent to her husband. Maternal love must needs be an absorbing passion; and Edmund had sacrificed too much to his mistress to endure the thought of sharing her affection, even with her child. "Oh, the little boy is here," he said with rather a blank look. "Yes, Edmund. He is to be your son henceforward, remember." "I cannot help loving him for his mother's sake, if—" "If what, Edmund?" asked Sylvia when he hesitated. "If you do not love him too much." "You need not be afraid of that," she answered, with her cold smile. "I am not a model mother." The phrase jarred upon him somehow, although but this moment he had been jealous of the child's claim upon her love. "You shall love him as much as you like, darling," he said. "I don't mean to be a cruel stepfather. The little one shall be as dear to me as if he were my very son. Is he not yours, and should not that be all sufficient title to my love? Ah, Sylvia," with a sigh, "you little know what fond daydreams I used to weave about your first child, our first child." "Never mind the past, Edmund. We have the present and the future." "Yes, darling. Happiness has come to us at last." "And now show me Antwerp, and all the famous pictures." "Let me seal my letters, and then I am at your service." "You have been writing to your mother, I suppose?" "No. I wrote yesterday, to tell her my whereabouts, in case she should care to write to me. But I hardly expect a letter. I am an outcast from Dean House." "For my sake? Well, Perium Place is at your disposal till St. John is 21. 20 long years to look forward to. We shall be tired of mansions by that time, and glad to fall back upon the comfortable old house which is mine by my marriage settlement. But to whom have you written that long letter, if not to your mother?" "To my chief at the bank, telling him that I can never return to Monkhampton, and he must get me a post elsewhere." "Tear up your letter, then, or add a postscript to say that you have done with banking altogether." "No, Sylvia. If we are to live at Perium Place, I shall simply cancel this letter, and write to tell the directors that, with their permission, I shall resume my duties a month hence." "What, you mean to stick in an office, to earn some paltry pittance of a few hundreds a year, when I have an ample income for both of us?" said Sylvia indignantly. "I mean to be, so far as possible, just the man I was when I first loved you, Sylvia, and not less independent. Do you think I could know an hour's happiness if I felt myself a pensioner upon the wealth your first husband left you? No, dearest, let me but earn my living. My habits are simple, my wants few. Let me earn my 500 a year, which will more than suffice for my own maintenance, and though I may live among splendours that are not my own, I shall feel myself not the less an honest working man, not quite unworthy of your love." "Do as you please," said Sylvia, offended, but stifling her anger. "I see you intend to be my master." "No, dearest, only the master of my own independence. In all reasonable things I will be your slave." 58. Shadrach Bayne loses the scent. Mr. Bayne arrived at Antwerp the day after that meeting between Lady Perium and her lover. He had been detained at Ostend for some hours, arriving in the early summer dawn, when only a melancholy waiter with half-shut eyes was to be found astir at the hotel where Mr. Bayne sought shelter and refreshment. There would be no train to carry him on to Antwerp till 8 o'clock. The slumberous waiter took Mr. Bayne into a salle à manger, with 3 long windows, curtained with white muslin, looking into a dismal courtyard. Here, on a narrow table, appeared those pasteboard piles of fruit and those bouquets of painted paper flowers which beautified the daily meal for the patrons of the hotel. These decorations seemed never to be removed by night or day, since there they were at 5 o'clock in the morning. The traveller seated himself at one end of the table, and after waiting about an hour was rewarded with a breakfast of coffee and rolls and a cold fowl. This dispatched, he perambulated the silent town and the sea wall, thinking his own thoughts, and but little moved to admiration by the novelty of the scene around him. Shall I be in time to find them? That was the question which he was perpetually asking of fate, and by them he meant Sylvia and Edmund. Little by little the shutters were opened, shrill-voiced maidservants appeared, and began with vigorous mops to splash and purify the thresholds of doors. Ostend gradually awoke to life, and at last, after a delay that had sorely vexed the soul of Mr. Bayne, the Antwerp train started, and jogged along the sandy country at the leisurely pace of Belgian trains in general. Such a stunted apology for a train as it seemed to Mr. Bayne, who was accustomed to the West Country Express, with its long line of carriages and screaming engine, rushing arrow swift across the face of the country. This train travelled at a foot pace. I could have walked faster, thought Mr. Bayne impatiently, as he looked at his opposite neighbour, a fat little priest whose breath sent forth odours of garlic as he read his breviary. A stalwart matron sat beside Mr. Bayne. Brawny youths and damsels filled the remaining seats, and stuffed the carriage with warm humanity. The Belgian trains contain no more carriages than can be filled to repletion. Never had Mr. Bayne endured such a wearisome journey. The innumerable little stations, the dust, the heat, the countrywomen who assailed the travellers with baskets of fruit, the everlasting talk and screaming at every halting place, the getting in and getting out worried his anxious brain. His patience had been sorely exercised by the time the train rumbled into the gloomy Antwerp terminus. The sun seemed at its hottest as Mr. Bayne drove through the streets where everything glared whitely at him. Happily the drive was short, and he found himself at the door of the Peter Paul Hotel. "There is an English gentleman staying here, I believe," he began in rather awkward French. "Anglais reste ici. Nommé Standen?" "Mr. Standen was here, sir, this morning," answered the waiter in very fair English. He was a German waiter, a wanderer on the face of the earth, and a linguist. "He left this morning." "Left? At what time this morning?" This was a death blow. If Edmund Standen had left Antwerp, Mr. Bayne felt little doubt Sylvia had also left the city. She could but have come here for one purpose, to join her lover. He gone, she must have gone too. "You are sure Mr. Standen left Antwerp?" he asked the waiter. "Sure that he did not go to another hotel?" "Quite sure, sir. He drove to the railway station before 8 this morning." "Do you know where he was going?" "No, sir, not exactly. But when he first arrived here he told me that he was going on to Cologne. It is possible that he may have changed his plans, but he said nothing to that effect." "Have you had an English lady staying at this house, yesterday, for instance, Lady Perriam?" "There has been no English lady staying in the house, sir. But an English lady came here yesterday at about noon to see Mr. Standen, and they went out together. Mr. Standen was absent all day." "Was the lady young, and in deep mourning?" "Precisely, sir. Young, in mourning, and extremely pretty." "That will do. Have you any idea where the lady was staying?" "It was most likely at the Hotel St. Antoine, since Mr. Standen said he had dined at that hotel when he came in last night." Mr. Bayne rewarded the waiter and drove off to the St. Antoine, there to discover that Lady Perriam had been there, had taken the principal suite of apartments with the intention of occupying them some time, as the manager supposed, and had departed with bag and baggage, femme de chambre, child and nurse, that morning at 8 o'clock for Cologne, the manager believed. Mr. Bayne started for Cologne by the first train that would convey him. He snatched a hasty savorless meal at the buffet of the railway station, and departed without rest or respite, sorely tormented in mind. They had the start of him, and there was no knowing how long they might keep that advantage. There was only one thought from which he could derive comfort. Certain preliminaries must be gone through before Mr. Standen could marry Sylvia; certain papers procured, certain notices given, before the knot could be tied. These preliminaries would require time for their fulfilment; and before the time could elapse Mr. Bayne would have overtaken the lovers. It was night when he arrived at Cologne, too late for inquiries that must needs occupy considerable time, as he had no clue to help him in his search. He did what he could. He questioned the custom house officers as to any English travellers who might have arrived at Cologne that night. But the custom house people told him that swarms of English travellers arrived at Cologne by every train, that almost all travellers were English or American, which came to the same thing. They had no power to distinguish one particular group among the herd of autumnal tourists. Mr. Bayne began his quest at 8 o'clock next morning, and pursued it till noon. He made his inquiries at every decent hotel in Cologne, and even at boarding houses, but learned nothing definite. No one could tell him of any party answering his description, and as to name, travellers were for the most part nameless. They came and went, and the hotel keepers knew no more of them than of the swallows that flew over the housetops. Mr. Bayne ceased from his endeavours thoroughly disheartened, knowing not which way to go. From Cologne they might have taken one of many routes. He took the one most frequented, and went up the Rhine in a steamer, stopping at every landing place, everywhere pursuing his search, and always vainly. Then he turned back, branched off, and explored the line in another direction. He spent more than a fortnight in this manner, roaming through Germany like a modern embodiment of the wandering Jew, writing to his son every night, and appointing the post office to which his letters were to be sent, and thus continuing to keep himself tolerably well acquainted with the progress of his business, and able to give detailed instructions upon all work he had in hand, so that, although Mr. Bayne was in Germany, it was not the less Shadrach Bayne's intellect which ruled in the Monkhampton office. His clients could hardly feel impatient when his chief clerk read the clear and sharp sentences in which Mr. Bayne gave his instructions for the conduct of their affairs. "Upon my word, he's a wonderful man," they said. "He never forgets anything. Such a clear head." He had entered upon the third week of this fruitless search, had driven and walked to and fro in the scorching August heat, amidst the blinding glare of the white dusty streets, passing a stranger through curious old towns, and taking no more interest in the various pictures that passed before his weary eyes, than if he had been amidst Sahara's arid waste. He was sick at heart, and he felt as if he had been wandering up and down this foreign land by road and rail for months instead of weeks. The strange diet disagreed with him. The unknown tongues that sounded thick, fierce, and guttural in his ear, worried him. The sense of failure was the sharpest torture of all. Never till now had Shadrach Bayne been beaten. "I hold the secret which will make her my slave if I can find her before she is Edmund Standon's wife," he told himself. "But if I am too late, if she is married before I can overtake them, what then?" "Why then," mused Shadrach Bayne, after an interval of deepest thought, "let me remember how she has cheated me. Revenge is sweet. Sir Aubrey was a good friend to me. It would be hard that I should let his murder go unavenged." Mr. Bayne had even consulted the police, had taken the professional opinion as to his chances of success. But the chief of police to whom he applied shrugged his shoulders, and gave the applicant no encouragement. "In the first place," he said with official dignity, "this is a matter in which we could not possibly concern ourselves. But as a mere word of friendly advice, I may as well tell you that were I in a position to help you, such a search would be utterly hopeless. When you left Antwerp you had already lost the trail. You had no certain knowledge that the people you want had come to Cologne. When you left Cologne you were completely at sea. The time you have spent since is time lost. Your friends may be in France, in Switzerland, in Italy, or they may even have gone back to England." Gone back to England! That sentence struck upon Mr. Bayne's ear like the vaguely worded counsel of a Greek oracle. They may have gone back to England! A sudden idea struck him. He was a fool in these wretched German towns, voiceless, almost mindless. Better to fight with weapons he was used to handle. This dogged stage by stage pursuit had come to nothing. He had spent money, wearied himself to no end. He thanked the German police officer, and started that night on his return to England. But not to Monkhampton. Beaten and baffled as he had been so far, he had no idea of abandoning his search. He meant to find Lady Perriam. There was, of course, little doubt that she would eventually return to the place. She had too much at stake to turn wanderer over the face of the earth. She would go back to Perriam by and by. But Shadrach Bayne firmly believed that when she did return there it would be as Mr. Standon's wife. This was the contingency which he had to prevent. 3 days' journeying by land and sea took him to London, where he put up at a private hotel in one of the streets of the Strand, a comfortable, homely place enough, which he had been in the habit of using for the last 20 years whenever he had occasion to stay in London. He was known here, and respected, and not overcharged. He had the entire use of a small private sitting-room, the landlady's own particular parlour, which she was too busy to occupy herself, without paying for that accommodation. The house was quiet and orderly, and remote from observation. Here Mr. Bayne felt like the spider in his web. He could spin his airy threads securely. His first act was to send the following advertisement for insertion in the Times newspaper: Mary Tringfold, widow, now or lately of Hilldrop Farm, near Monkhampton, may hear of something to her advantage by applying to Y. at the Post Office, Norfolk Street, Strand. If Lady Perriam is in England, Mrs. Tringfold is in England also, Mr. Bayne reflected, and it will be strange if she doesn't fall into the trap I've set for her and answer that letter. If she does answer it, the rest is easy enough. Mr. Bayne managed his little plan with the utmost nicety and discretion. Of course it would not do for him to appear in the transaction. If Mary Tringfold answered that advertisement and asked for an interview with the advertiser, a stranger must appear, a strange lawyer, who would tell her that a small legacy had been left her by a former mistress. She had been in service before she married, and Shadrach Bayne had her history at his fingers' ends. It would be worth Mr. Bayne's while to give a £10 note for the information he wanted, and a £10 legacy would satisfy Mrs. Tringfold that she had not been duped by the advertiser. Before handing her this money it would be easy enough for a sharp-witted young man to draw from her all the information she had to give about her mistress and Mr. Standon, where they had been, where they were, their actions in the past, and their plans for the future. He had a handy tool for this business in the person of his landlady's son, a clerk in a lawyer's office, the modern type of fast youth who, in his own more expressive than elegant phraseology, was ready for anything, from pitch and toss to manslaughter. End of chapters 57 and 58. Chapters 59 and 60 of Taken at the Flood by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 59. Secret Service. Shadrach Bayne, having issued his advertisement, waited like the spider for that unwary fly which he deemed must, sooner or later, even if the fly should haply be still a wanderer in foreign lands, become enmeshed in his net. No spider in the last stage of attenuation for lack of flies was ever more anxious or impatient than Mr. Bayne. The advertisement had appeared 3 times, and he was beginning to think that his return to England had been altogether a mistake and the absolute surrender of all his chances, when triumph and hope came to him in the shape of a letter from Mrs. Tringfold, a letter addressed from No. 17 Willoughby Crescent, Hyde Park. Now Mrs. Tringfold was not likely to be residing in so fashionable and expensive a district as Tyburnia if she were living at her own charge. It was clear that she was still with Lady Perriam, and Willoughby Crescent was Lady Perriam's abode; whereby Mr. Bayne felt that the fly was almost in his web. Mrs. Tringfold's missive was one of those composite documents fluctuating between a note and letter in which her class delights. It ran thus: Mrs. Mary Tringfold's compelments to Mr. Y. Esquire, which advertised in the Times paper, and I am the Mary Tringfold mentioned, which her late husband was a farmer at Hilldrop Farm. I shall be glad to hear of anythink to my advantage, and she will call if Mr. Y. will say where. Your obedient servant, Mrs. Tringfold. P.S. I am in service with a lady and can only come out after the baby is gone to bed. Y., or Shadrach Bayne, by his willing agent, John Sadgrove, the landlady's eldest hope, made haste to answer this letter by a telegram, appointing that evening at 9 o'clock for an interview at the Quayside Hotel, Embankment Street, Strand. That postscript about the baby gave Mr. Bayne the delightful assurance that Lady Perriam was to be found in Willoughby Crescent. Weak as were her maternal instincts, she was hardly likely to separate herself from a son upon whom her future position in some measure depended. "Go where she will, she'll stick to the boy," mused Mr. Bayne. "The only question is whether by this time she may not be the wife of Edmund Standen. I shall know that before 10 o'clock to-night, if Mrs. Stringfold keeps her appointment." The private sitting-room which Mr. Bayne had the privilege of using at the Quayside Hotel was a little bit of a three-cornered apartment on the first floor, cut off a landing, and opening into a larger room in which the landlady and her family took their meals. In this larger room Mr. Bayne was to plant himself, close to the door of communication, which was to be left artfully ajar so as to give him the opportunity of hearing Mr. Sadgrove's interrogation of the visitor, and even of giving that young man a whispered hint if he found him wandering from his brief or not master of the situation. Mr. Sadgrove, to whose budding genius any little business of a secret and furtive nature was peculiarly interesting, flung himself heart and soul into the case. He had ever admired Shadrach Bayne, had sat at his feet, as it were, from time to time, during the West Country solicitor's brief visits to the Quayside Hotel, and he felt proud to serve him, even without consideration of that modest pecuniary reward which Mr. Bayne had promised him. The young man felt as important as an Old Bailey practitioner when Mrs. Stringfold was ushered into the triangular parlour where he sat, with an official-looking inkstand and a quire of foolscap before him. The business of the legacy was speedily dispatched. There was a certain Miss Harper of Moss Street, 20 miles from Monkhampton, with whom Mrs. Stringfold had lived 10 years ago as a confidential maid and housekeeper, and whom she had nursed in her last illness. "She didn't leave you anything, did she?" asked John Sadgrove, with a businesslike air. "Not a sixpence, sir, though it was expected by most folks that she would leave me well provided for. The family give me some portion of her wardrobe. She had a handsome wardrobe, had old Miss Harper, not having the heart to wear her things for fear of spoiling 'em, but hoarding of 'em like in her drawers and chests. The fall I have on this evening was Miss Harper's, real Spanish blonde, and everlasting wear." "Well, I am happy to tell you that one of the late Miss Harper's relatives happened the other day to come across a packet of papers, and amongst them there was a memorandum in which Miss Harper stated her intention to leave you £10. "Well, sir, it isn't much, considering how faithfully I served her. But anythink comes welcome after so long." "The memorandum was not a legal document, remember. Miss Harper's relatives were under no obligation to act upon it. But with generosity that does them credit, they decided to let you have the whole benefit of Miss Harper's unfulfilled intention. I am commissioned by them to pay you the £10. "I'm sure, sir, I'm much beholden. Shall I write and thank the gentleman, or lady?" "No, they require no acknowledgment." "They're very good, sir. And I'm bound to say Miss Harper's family always treated me liberally. The family gave me my mourning, everythink of the best, though not so good as the black I'm wearing now for Sir Aubrey Perriam." "Sir Aubrey Perriam? The gentleman who married a pretty young woman shortly before his death?" said Mr. Sadgrove carelessly, as if he had known all about it ever so long ago. "I suppose the widow is married again by this time?" "No, sir, not married," answered Mrs. Stringfold significantly. "But thinking about it, eh?" "Thinking about it a good deal more than becomes a lady whose poor dear husband hasn't been 6 months in the grave. It's all very well to put up a marble tablet and shut yourself up in your own room and see no company and call that grief," said Mrs. Stringfold sententiously. "But if you go and marry a young man you was keeping company with beforehand, not 6 months after your husband's funeral, them as looks deep into things will think your marble tablet and your doleful ways nothing more than a blind. Blinds is made of a good many more things than calico at 6 halfpenny a yard, sir," added Mrs. Stringfold, winding up with an aphorism. "You can't expect grief to last for ever in young widows," rejoined Mr. Sadgrove jauntily. "But I suppose Lady Perriam is hardly thinking of marrying just yet awhile. 6 months hence or so she might make up her mind. She'll show some respect for the conveniences, as our French neighbours have it." "What would you say, sir, if I was to tell you that Lady Perriam is going to be married to her first sweetheart, which all Headingham knows there was carrying on between them before Sir Aubrey took a fancy to her, to morrow morning?" Nonsense, Mrs. Stringfold. I can't believe such a thing.
It's gospel truth, sir, whether you believe it or whether you do not.
Where are they to be married?
At St. Francis of Sissy, sir, just at the back of the crescent. A new church, and very high, they say, though to my eye the steeple isn't as tall as the spire of our new church at Monkhampton.
What time is the ceremony to take place?
At 10:30, and is to be strictly private, as it had need be. They're to go to the lakes for their honeymoon, and then back to Perham, to brazen it out, as I say, which Mr. Standen, being in the Monkhampton Bank, can't stay long away. Such a low match for a baronet's widow, and to give that precious boy a stepfather before he's cut his double teeth.
They are to meet at the church, I suppose, now, said Mr. Sadgrove in a conversational tone, after he had helped Mrs. Stringfold to a glass of sherry and a biscuit.
Yes, Lady Perham and him is to meet at the church at 10:20, and it'll all be over by 11. Celine, her maid, is to be the only person with her, and me and my blessed boy are to start off to Brighton directly after the wedding, and stay there in lodgings that has been took for us in Rock Gardens till we get our orders to go back to Perham. It's to be the dismallest wedding as ever I heard of."
"How long has Lady Perham been in Willoughby Crescent?"
"Close upon 3 weeks. We came here straight from Brussels."
"Oh, you were at Brussels previously, were you? Pray take another glass of that sherry. It won't do you any harm."
"Yes, sir. Wishing you your health. We was 3 days in Brussels after we left Antwerps, where I didn't see nothing worth looking at but the pole parrots in the Zoological Gardens. My lady was 3 days at Brussels seeing all the sights, pictures and churches, and the Battle of Waterloo. And then we left as abruptly as we'd left Antwerps, and came back to London, where we stopped one night at the hotel, and the next morning Mr. Standen came to say as he had found a furnished house to suit in Willoughby Crescent, and before Sir St. John's dinner time we was all comfortably settled, and glad I was to find myself among my rational fellow creatures once more, instead of those jabbering Belgies."
"Do you know why Lady Perham came back to London so suddenly?" asked Mr. Sadgrove, prompted by a whisper behind the door.
"No, sir. Not any more than that I heard my lady tell Mr. Standen one day at Brussels, when I went to her room to fetch the baby, one can't help having ears, that there was no place like London, and that people were free to do what they liked there without any one noticing them. 'London's like a forest,' she said. 'We shall be lost in it, Edmund.' It used to give me the cold shivers down my back to hear her call him by his Christian name, and Sir Aubrey not cold in his coffin, as you may say."
The door behind Mr. Sadgrove now gave a gentle creak or groan, which, in the language of the spirits, meant that Mr. Bayne had heard enough, so Mr. Sadgrove forthwith paid Mrs. Stringfold her legacy, 10 glistening new sovereigns, which made the young man's mouth water, and dismissed her, very well satisfied with what she had heard to her advantage. "Well, Mr. Bayne, did I manage it all right?" asked John Sadgrove with conscious merit, as Shadrach Bayne emerged from the adjoining chamber. "You couldn't have done it better, John, and here's the sovereign I promised you. But you must beg a few hours' liberty to-morrow morning, and go with me to the church where Lady Perham thinks she is going to be married. I may find you useful as a witness." "I'll run round to the office to-morrow morning to ask leave of absence, and be back here at 9:30. answered John Sadgrove blithely. "Are you going to put a stop to the marriage?" he asked. "I think it's more than likely I shall," replied Mr. Bayne with a grim smile. 60. Just impediment. It was the morning appointed for Sylvia's second marriage, that union which was to be the blessed fulfilment of all her girlish dreams, which was to bring her nothing but happiness. Restless had been her slumbers through the night that was gone, and haunted by awful dreams. Not once, but several times, in vague and various shapes, the event of the coming day had been enacted. Sometimes the scene had been lifelike enough, the circumstances possible, some element of reason in the fabric of her vision. At other times all had been densest darkness and wildest confusion. She had been drifting with her lover over storm-driven waves. They had stood together on the bare and empty deck of a wrecked vessel, while a priest in splendid vestments, such as she had seen at St. Gudule in Brussels, had recited the marriage service. And behold, just as he had joined their hands, a gigantic wave rose, white crested, and broke over the ship, sweeping away priest and bridegroom, and leaving her alone, whirling madly onward over that hideous ocean. In another dream she and Edmund had been together on some tropical waste of level sand, under a copper-colored sky, the sultry air thick with white fever-tainted vapor, and every now and then a cloud of burning sand blown over them by the sudden blast of a hot wind. Here too they knelt side by side, and a voice that came, the dreamer knew not whence, repeated the words of the marriage service. But before it was ended the bride looked at her companion, and lo! he had fallen dead at her side, and a vulture was swooping down upon him through that awful sky. It was broad day when she awoke from this last vision. She started up in her bed, her forehead damp with the cold dews of fear, and looked at the summer light shining in upon her through the uncurtained windows. Thank God, it was only a dream! She sprang up, rang for Celine, and began the operations of the toilette, though it was only 6 o'clock. Celine remonstrated politely, urged upon her mistress the duty of looking her loveliest in her wedding bonnet, the most delicious chapeau of white chip, ostrich feathers, and palest mauve, the faintest suggestion of half mourning, as a delicate compliment to the departed Sir Aubrey. "It's no use talking, Celine," replied Lady Perriam impatiently. "I shan't attempt to sleep any more. I have had such horrible dreams." "Horrible dreams on the eve of so happy a union? Mais, madame, c'est incroyable." "It is true, nevertheless. I suppose I have had too much anxiety lately." "À cause des dons du pauvre petit," said Celine naively. There had been trouble lately about Sir St. John's dental development, and the maid imagined that maternal solicitude might have disturbed her lady's slumbers. Sylvia felt considerably refreshed after a cold bath, a cup of strong tea, and an elaborate toilette. She looked lovely in her wedding dress of pearl grey satin, trimmed with heavy Spanish point lace, a matronly costume which rendered the youthfulness of her beauty all the more striking. "And now run downstairs and get me my letters," she said to Celine, as the clock on the chimney-piece struck 9. "The post must have come by this time." The only letter she thought of was a possible greeting from Edmund, one loving line perhaps to welcome the day. She had communicated with the housekeeper at Perriam Place, and ordered that letters should be sent to her, but of any such letter she had no thought this morning. Celine came back with a bulky little packet, wrapped in the thickest and creamiest paper, sealed with several seals. A jeweller's parcel, evidently. This was Edmund's greeting. She also brought a letter, a foreign letter, addressed to Perriam Place, in a delicate, nervous hand, a hand Sylvia knew very well, and readdressed to Willoughby Crescent in the housekeeper's clumsier characters. This letter was from Mr. Carew. His epistles were not frequent, and their purport was generally either to ask or to acknowledge money. He had continued his easy life in the south of France, only varying it by an occasional visit to Paris, and Sylvia had every reason to suppose that he would spend the rest of his days in that agreeable exile. She had been sufficiently liberal to him, and they corresponded in most affectionate terms; but Sylvia did not sigh for reunion with the father in whose companionship she had spent so many years of her life. She opened Edmund's packet first. It contained a ruby velvet case with her monogram, her new monogram, S.S., in gold, and inside the case, on a bed of white satin, reposed a diamond cross, the gems of large size and of purest colour. Upon a slip of paper in the case Edmund had written these lines: "Wear this to-morrow, dearest, for my sake, instead of the jewels you showed me last night. I should like to think that you wore my gift rather than Sir Aubrey's, on that solemn day which is to unite us for ever." "My own generous Edmund," murmured Sylvia, and unwonted tears clouded her vision. She had shown him her diamond necklace, Sir Aubrey's gift, the day before, and had asked him half in sport if she should wear it on her wedding day. She clasped the cross on her neck before she even thought of her father's letter. The diamonds sparkled between the folds of rich lace which veiled throat and bosom. When her lover's offering had been adjusted to her satisfaction, with much enthusiasm and ejaculation on the part of Celine, Lady Perriam seated herself at the breakfast table to sip a second cup of tea, and to read her father's letter. "You can go now, Celine," she said, "but come to me at 9:15 to arrange my bonnet and veil." Mr. Carew's letter was briefer than usual, for in the calm retirement of his unoccupied life he had been wont to write to his daughter with considerable amplitude. He prided himself upon being able to write a good letter, and his epistles had been for the most part as elaborate as those of travellers who have an eye to publishing their effusions in a permanent form, at the request of friends. To-day the letter was brief, and the tidings it conveyed were not agreeable. Sylvia's brow darkened as she read it. My dear Sylvia, after 2 years' residence in this genial climate, I find my health established, and that nature has, in some measure, compensated herself by profound rest for the wear and tear of those years of toil which had made me an old man before my time. With renewed strength I find reawakening within me those yearnings for home and country which are, I suppose, innate in every breast. You are now your own mistress, rich and secure in the noble position which your attractions won for you. If I come now to sit beside your hearth, or perchance to dwell at a short distance from your house in some modest retreat of my own, I shall not feel myself an intruder. I am coming, therefore, my dear child, to claim your affectionate welcome, to taste the sweets of your bounty. You have been most generous to me during my exile, but I crave something more than pecuniary aid. I languish for your society, your ever dutiful regard. I shall be with you, perhaps, in a day or two after you receive this letter. For the first time, therefore, I may venture to close my sheet with au revoir instead of adieu. Your attached father, James Carew. One would imagine my evil genius had put it into his head to come back at such a time, thought Sylvia. I wonder whether I have an evil genius. Most people would say no, for I have been so lucky. But then the devils we read of gave their slaves all their desires at the outset. She tried to calculate the time that must elapse before her father could arrive in England, but his letter was too vaguely written. It was dated nearly a week ago. If he had followed it he might be in England already. He would go straight to Perium Place, no doubt, find her absent, obtain her address from the housekeeper, who would be awed by his paternal authority, and come to Willoughby Crescent in quest of her. Hope whispered that he would come too late. A bell rang loudly while she was standing with the letter in her hand, a bell that sent a thrill of fear through her heart, though it might be a commonplace summons enough. She had been breakfasting in a boudoir that had been extemporized for her, a bright little apartment adjoining her dressing-room. This room was held sacred to her privacy, and when a masculine step sounded presently on the landing she told herself it must be Edmund. No one else would venture to intrude at such an hour. Celine opened the door and screamed, "Madame, it is Monsieur your father!" Another moment and Sylvia, shedding tears of vexation, was clasped to her father's breast. Not so fondly would he have clasped her in the old days when he was the parish schoolmaster, and she his unrecompensed handmaiden. It may be that severance had taught him the value of his only daughter. "My love!" he exclaimed with emotion, "this is rapture. I knew not the feelings of a father's heart till this moment." For half a minute or so he indulged those feelings, and shed, or seemed to be shedding, paternal tears upon Sylvia's soft brown hair. After that gush of emotion he put her suddenly away from him. "Let me look at you, my love," he exclaimed. "Let me see how these 2 years have ripened your young beauty. Yes, the bud is expanding into a blossom, but it has not lost the freshness of its early bloom. But, my sweet Sylvia, what in heaven's name is the meaning of such a splendid dress at this early hour? Has fashion invented some morning assembly? What is the meaning of this almost bridal attire?" Sylvia looked him straight in the face, nerving herself for a battle. "It simply means that I am going to be married," she answered in her coldest, hardest tones, tones that meant no surrender. "You are going to be married?" ejaculated Mr. Carew. "6 months after your husband's death? Such a husband as Sir Aubrey Perium?" "I know that it may seem strange to you, to the world," answered Sylvia, "but I do not hold myself accountable to the world, or to you. I consult my own feelings this time. I sacrificed myself once to win comfort and ease for you. It would be a poor return if you were to reward that sacrifice by opposition,
now that I seek happiness for myself."
"The world will say hard things of you for this marriage, Sylvia."
"Let the world say what it will. The world is always hard, hard to the rich, harder to the poor, hard to beauty, hard to virtue. Let the world hate me. It can never trample on me again, for I ask nothing from it. I am my own mistress. I am tired of a lonely, unprotected life, and I am going to marry the lover of my youth, the only man I ever loved. Is that such a wicked act?"
"It is an improper act to marry 6 months after your husband's death."
"I suppose if widow burning were the fashion in this country, you would come and ask me to be burnt alive rather than outrage society," said Sylvia, with a bitter laugh. "You sold me to the highest bidder, and you have profited by the bargain, and are likely to profit by it for the rest of your life. What more do you want? Did you intend to make a second barter, to find another rich man to pay you the price of my broken heart?"
"That is unkind, Sylvia. If I profited in a small degree by your union with Sir Aubrey, you profited largely. And I think you were as much gratified to become Lady Perriam as I was to see you raised to that proud position. Let us not dispute, my love. For your own sake I would entreat you to postpone your marriage. There is no reason you should not marry Mr. Stanton when a decent interval has elapsed. But if I have any influence with you, I will exert it to the utmost to hinder your taking a step which will be the ruin of your good name."
"You have no influence with me. You exhausted all your stock of influence when you persuaded me to marry Sir Aubrey Perriam. You shall not come a second time between me and the man I love."
"Sylvia," cried her father desperately, "cannot you understand that I have no objection to make to your ultimate union with Mr. Stanton? I only ask you to respect the laws of society, and to delay this marriage, if only for 6 months."
"Delays are dangerous," answered Sylvia. "Who knows what might happen in 6 months?"
"What have you to fear? You who have youth, wealth, and beauty. Edmund Stanton has everything to gain by marrying you."
"He might not always think so. Come, my dear father," continued Sylvia, in a lighter tone, "don't let us spoil this reunion by a needless dispute. You have always taken your way in life, let me take mine, unassailed by advice or interference. Do this, and we shall always be good friends. Oppose me, and—" She finished the sentence with a shrug of her shoulders, which was easy of interpretation.
"What then?" asked Mr. Carew.
"In that case I must try to forget that I have a father."
"Very well, Sylvia. Take your own way. After all, it is your reputation and not mine that is at stake. Why should I trouble myself about the matter? I have never been in the habit of making myself unhappy about other people's business. Let us say no more about it. Perhaps you will be good enough to give me some breakfast. I went down to Perriam yesterday, found that you were living in London, got your address from the housekeeper, and came back to town by the evening mail. I slept at the Great Western Hotel, and in my impatience to see you would not even wait to breakfast before coming here."
"You shall not suffer for that sacrifice," said Sylvia gaily. She was eager to conciliate this unwelcome parent, now that he showed himself amenable to reason. She rang the bell, ordered the best breakfast the house could produce at 10 minutes' notice, and presently Mr. Carew found himself seated at a well-furnished table, with his daughter opposite to him, the aroma of choicest mocha ascending to his nostrils, and a rush-bound flask of maraschino at his elbow. "After all, papa, if you will only take things pleasantly, your unexpected arrival is not inopportune," said Sylvia, ministering to her parent's wants with daintiest care. "You can go to church with me. I shall feel a less desolate creature if I have your arm to lean on."
"My love, no one is desolate with 5,000 a year," said Mr. Carew sententiously. "For people with such an income the world teems with friends."
"Yes, friends who are enemies in disguise. Wolves in sheepskin," answered Sylvia bitterly. "I shall not waste my money in paying for such friendship. My only hope of happiness is with the man who loved me for my own sake when I was your penniless daughter."
Mr. Carew ate his breakfast, wound up with a glass of maraschino, and discreetly held his peace. After all, as he had remarked just now, his daughter's too speedy marriage would make no difference to him. It was she who must suffer the world's scorn. They drove to the church, the new Gothic temple with its painted windows, which made patches of luminous colour in the half light of the vaulted aisles. Edmund was waiting for them in the porch, looking as happy as a bridegroom should look. No remorseful thought troubled him to-day. Mind and heart were alike filled with one subject, and that was Sylvia. He was surprised to see Mr. Carew, but welcomed him cordially, ready to forgive and forget the schoolmaster's insolent reception of his proposal 2 years ago. To-day was no day for the remembrance of old injuries. Marriage would be but a sorry business if every man were not a Christian on his wedding day. "My Sylvia," said the bridegroom proudly, as he drew her a little aside from the clergyman and Mr. Carew, and looked at her with fond, admiring eyes. "How lovely you have made yourself, as if satin and lace were needed to enhance your beauty. If you had come to me in rags, had come to me a beggar girl out of yonder street, I should love you every bit as well. My Sylvia, mine at last, mine for ever from to-day." "Are you ready?" asked the clerk, who had remained politely unconscious of this sentimental episode. "Quite ready," answered Edmund, putting Sylvia's arm through his, and moving up the aisle. "Not quite, I think, when you have heard what I have to tell you," said a familiar voice, as Mr. Bayne emerged from the shadow of a clustered column, and stood in front of bride and bridegroom. Sylvia gave a cry of despair, a shriek that echoed loud in the vaulted aisles, and flung herself upon her lover's breast. "He shall not part us," she said. "Edmund, Edmund, be true to me. Let him say what he will." End of chapters 59 and 60. Chapters 61 and 62 of Taken at the Flood by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 61. At Bay. Edmund's strong arm clasped Sylvia closer to his breast. "My dearest, what need of alarm?" he whispered. "I am yours to the end of life." Then, turning to Shadrach Bayne, he exclaimed angrily, "Pray, sir, what is the meaning of this most unwarrantable intrusion?" "Unwarrantable, perhaps; though if I had been inclined that way, I might have come with a magistrate's warrant and a detective officer. You have reason to thank me for this intrusion, Mr. Stanton, and to thank Providence that I am here in time to prevent your marriage with that lady." "That you will never do, sir, let your audacity go as far as it may. Stand out of the way, if you please, Mr. Bayne, and let us pass to the altar." "If you value your future peace, you had better hear what I have to say first," said Shadrach Bayne, with undisturbed coolness. Perhaps this gentleman, glancing at the incumbent, who had come from the chancel to ascertain what was wrong, would be good enough to allow us a few minutes' private conversation in the vestry. "Unless Lady Perriam would like me to speak out before every one." "What can you have to say?" asked Sylvia, looking up at him. Great heaven, what a blanched death-like face she lifted from the shelter of her lover's breast! From brow to lip white as her bridal veil. "Cannot you guess, Lady Perriam?" demanded Mr. Bayne, with a threatening significance in his tones. "Before Mr. Stanton makes you his wife, and takes the burden of your encumbrances on his shoulders, I should like, for his sake, his father was a good friend to my father, and I've a natural interest in his welfare on that account, before the knot is tied, I should like to ask you a few questions about the brother-in-law you shut up in a madhouse the other day." Sylvia stretched out her hands as if to stop that awful accuser who confronted her with a countenance of stone. She had cheated and disappointed him, and Mr. Bayne had no mercy for people who did either. He was implacable against the woman who had done both. "Pray let us go into the vestry," she cried in piteous appeal to the clergyman. "Father, stay where you are. Let this man say what he pleases against me, it is only a tissue of lies. But I don't want everybody to hear me insulted. Edmund can defend me. Edmund will stand by me. Yes, till death." She said this with an air of defiance that was almost noble. She flung herself again upon her lover's breast, as if that were her strong rock. The clerk led the way to the vestry, looking infinitely shocked at this disturbance, Sylvia, Edmund, and Mr. Bayne following. Here, with the door shut upon them, they could say what they liked, without creating a scandal in the church. The clergyman and Mr. Carew remained in the aisle, bewildered. "I fear there will be no wedding to-day," said the incumbent. "Pshaw, my dear sir, a mere passing cloud. I know something of this man. The late Sir Aubrey Perriam's land steward, a self-seeking fellow who was allowed to exercise a great deal too much power during my son-in-law's life. I always suspected him to be a scoundrel." Thus spoke Mr. Carew with a mind ill at ease. Mr. Bayne was too prudent a man to make a disturbance of this kind without being tolerably sure of his ground. And Sylvia's white face had been a mute confession of guilt. What it might all mean James Carew felt powerless even to conjecture, but he feared it must mean something bad. An intrigue, perhaps, or a broken promise of marriage. The vestry door was shut, and those three were alone. Mr. Bayne had left his satellite, John Sadgrove, in the church porch, ready to be of use in the event of his being wanted. "Well, sir," said Edmund sternly, "we are alone. What have you to say to us? And pray what do you mean by asserting that this lady's brother-in-law has been shut up in a madhouse at her instigation?" No gossip from Monkhampton had reached Edmund since his departure. His letters from the bank had been of a purely business character. His mother had written to him only once, a letter full of anger and bitterness, in which she renounced all kindred with him. He knew nothing, therefore, of Mordred's removal from Perriam Place, an event which had been sufficiently discussed within a 40-mile radius of Monkhampton. "I state the simple truth, that Mordred Perriam was removed from the house in which he had lived a harmless, irreproachable life for the last 30 years, removed at an hour's warning, by this lady, and confined in a private lunatic asylum." "Sylvia," exclaimed Edmund, "look up and tell me that this fellow is a liar." "Does she look like denying it?" sneered Mr. Bayne, pointing to the pallid face with its half-closed eyelids and agonized lips, which was slowly turned to the light of day. "It is true that Mordred is in a private asylum," said Sylvia. "I did not like to tell you, Edmund. It was such a dreadful calamity to speak about, and it might have set you against me. But it was at that man's advice I had Mordred removed from Perriam. He is a liar if he denies that." "I do deny that I ever directly advised you to incarcerate Mordred Perriam," returned Mr. Bayne unflinchingly. "I told you what people said about him. I told you that people wanted to know why he had been kept a prisoner in his own rooms, hardly permitted to breathe the air of heaven, ever since his brother's death. I warned you of the scandals that were circulating against you. And I asked you, for your own sake, to let me see Mordred Perriam, and assure myself that he was not shut up in his rooms at Perriam Place, under watch and ward of a nurse, against his will, that he was not imprisoned to serve any purpose of yours. Let me be sure of this, I said to you, and I will give the lie to anyone who dares to traduce you. I will be your champion and defender. What was your answer to my request, Lady Perriam? An eminently practical one. The day after I said this to you, Mordred Perriam was taken away from the home of his ancestors in the keeping of a madhouse doctor. Without an hour's pause for consideration or advice, without help or counsel from any living creature, you smuggled your dead husband's brother into an obscure asylum. Sylvia, is there one word of truth in this man's charge against you?" cried Edmund, looking down at that terror-stricken face, whose awful pallor sent a thrill of terror to his heart. Only by some indication of guilt in herself could he believe her guilty. The words of her accuser would have seemed to him idle as the faint breathings of the summer wind but for that dreadful look in her changed face, which betrayed so abject a terror in the heart whose wild beating he felt against his breast. "Speak, Sylvia," he entreated. "Speak, my love, and give this fellow the lie. Tell him that your brother-in-law was not smuggled into an asylum, that there was no undue haste, no secrecy, that you were fully justified in all you did." "I was justified," she answered, meeting her lover's searching look with a gaze as steadfast, with eyes that would have looked in the face of death just as calmly. Her terror was vanquished now. Ruin was before her, perhaps, but the nervous force, the indomitable courage which had sustained her so long had returned to her once more. Every vestige of youthful bloom had faded from lip and cheek. Her face had aged by 10 years in hue and expression, but her eyes shone their brightest, and her pallid lips were firmly set, defying misery and shame. "I was justified," she repeated. "The doctor to whom I confided Mr. Perriam was a doctor recommended by that man. 2 medical men certified his insanity. Everything was done fairly and openly. Yes, openly. I was not bound to give Mr. Bayne notice of my intention. He is not my master." "Tell me why you took this sudden resolve of sending Mr. Perriam to a madhouse?" asked Edmund, somewhat reassured by her bolder manner, but still feeling that there was some deeper meaning in her agitation than a woman's natural shrinking from a false charge. Had he become suddenly violent? "Shall I tell you why Lady Perriam had him smuggled into a madhouse, Mr. Stanton?" asked Shadrach Bayne. "No, sir, I ask no question of you. I seek no information from you. I address my inquiry to the lady who will presently be my wife." "You had better spare yourself the trouble," said the agent, with a short laugh. "You'll never get Lady Perriam to answer that question. I'll tell you why she put poor harmless Mordred out of the way, a man who was no more demented than I am. She did it because he knew her secret, knew that her husband, Sir Aubrey, came to an untimely death at her hands." Sylvia gave a shriek and dropped to the ground at her lover's feet, with her arms extended above her head in adjuration. "As surely as there is a God whose justice I have offended, that is a black and bitter lie," she cried, her eyes gazing solemnly upward, as if she would indeed invoke divinity to witness her truth. "I am guiltless of my husband's blood." "If you did not murder him, you planned his murder," said Shadrach Bayne. "I dare say you were too dainty a lady to do the business yourself, so you got your tool and sycophant, Mrs. Carter, to take the dirty work off your hands." "It is false, all false!" cried Sylvia, still on the ground. Edmund raised her to her feet, held her as he had held her before, encircled and defended by his arm. "If we were not in a church, Mr. Bayne, I should knock you down," he said coolly. "As it is, I'll only ask you to walk out of this room a little quicker than you came into it, for fear I should be tempted to forget that the building is sacred. Shall I go away, Mr. Stanton, and leave you to marry this lady? Would it not be just as well to put her to the test first? Postpone your wedding till to-morrow, and come with me to unearth Mr. Perriam. The place where my lady has sent him is only an hour's journey from London. See Sir Aubrey's brother for yourself. If there is no secret, if there has been no foul play, I'll make the most profound apology to that lady for having done her so deep a wrong. But at the worst there will not be much harm done. The postponement of the ceremony intended for to-day can be of very little consequence if you are but in the same mind to-morrow." "Let it be so," said Edmund decisively, after a moment's thought. "We will delay our marriage till to-morrow, Sylvia, and I will devote to-day to the proof of this man's calumny." "You will not go with him!" cried Sylvia wildly, the old look of terror coming back to her face. "You will not go with him, Edmund. To do that is to acknowledge your belief in his slander. You cannot surely believe—" "I believe nothing against you, dearest. But there is only one way of meeting such a scandal as this, and that is to unearth its falsehood. I will go to the asylum with Mr. Bayne. I will see and speak with your supposed victim, and I will demonstrate your innocence from any wrong towards him before I come back to you." "Edmund!" pleaded Sylvia desperately, slipping from her lover's breast to his feet, where she knelt, a piteous spectacle of self-abasement. "Edmund, if you ever loved me, do not go." "I love you too well to suffer your good name to rest under a cloud that I can dispel. Contemptible as the slander may be, the lie must be made manifest." "You are going, then?" she asked despairingly. "I am going, Sylvia. Release me," as she clung about his knees. "My dearest love, your humiliation is more painful to me than this man's accusation." He freed himself from that despairing clasp, opened the door, and beckoned to Mr. Carew, who was waiting with an anxious face not far from the entrance to the vestry. "Take care of your daughter," he said. "Take her home immediately, and let no one intrude upon her till my return. There will be no wedding to-day. I shall be back in a few hours to explain everything." "Are you really going, Edmund?" asked Sylvia. She stood by the door, marble pale, but with the calm of spent passion. Her breath came faintly and thickly, and that was the only token of her agitation. "Yes, dear love, I am going to vindicate your honor." "Kiss me once more, Edmund, before we part." He was quick to obey the behest. He clasped her to his heart and kissed lips and brow. "Do you remember our parting kiss in Headingham churchyard, Edmund? A Judas kiss you thought it afterwards, for it heralded your betrayal. Kiss me once again. Trust me once again, if only for an hour. This is a bitterer farewell to me. Now go." She put him from her with a firm gesture, and went to her father's side, once more mistress of herself.
"Let us go home, papa," she said, taking Mr. Carew's arm.
"Good-bye, dearest," whispered Edmund. "Remember, it is only for a few hours. I shall return to tell you that I have exploded this senseless slander."
"Or not return at all," she answered in a slow, sad voice, with the dull quiet of despair. "Go, Edmund. We have loved each other very dearly, but fate has been against us."
He looked at her wonderingly, as if half fearing that her mind had lost its balance, and then tore himself away. She had spoken the truth. This was indeed a more painful parting than their first farewell, even though he thought to come back to her before the day was done, thought that their wedding was only put off for 24 hours. "Now, sir," he said to Shadrach Bayne, "I am ready." "I've a cab waiting outside," returned that gentleman coolly. "We shall catch the 12 o'clock train at King's Cross." 62.
Who said, "Let death come now, 'tis right to die."
Mr. Carew took his daughter back to the carriage, sorely disturbed in mind, and in profoundest darkness of spirit as to the cause of this disturbance. The incumbent accompanied them to the carriage, blandly sympathizing with Lady Perriam under these unpleasant circumstances. A small sprinkling of nursemaids, with perambulators and a fringe of street boys, had gathered on the pavement before the church door, having scented out a wedding, despite the privacy which had attended Lady Perriam's arrangements. The young women stared their hardest at the bride as she came into the open daylight with her veil gathered across her face. Sylvia's death-like pallor showed conspicuously through that transparent tissue, and there were murmurs of wondering compassion at the whiteness of her face. The small boys in the crowd commented freely upon the bride's pallid countenance, and opined that she had been married to that "skinny old bloke," meaning Mr. Carew, against her wish. Not a word did Sylvia utter during the brief drive to Willoughby Crescent. She alighted without the help of her father's arm, passed with a quick firm step into the hall, and ran upstairs. Mr. Carew followed her, and arrived breathless at the door of her boudoir just as she had reached it. She turned and confronted him with angry eyes.
"Why do you follow me?" she exclaimed. "I want nothing except to be left alone."
"But, Sylvia, for mercy's sake, tell me the meaning of all this unhappiness. What brought that man Bayne to the vestry?"
"You will know soon enough. Cannot you leave me in peace for a few hours? Your wish has been gratified. My marriage is postponed."
"I should be glad of it if there were no trouble for you involved in the postponement. Why cannot you trust me? Your own father."
"Because you never acted a father's part towards me," answered Lady Perriam. "I would sooner appeal to strangers for mercy or for aid than to you. Leave me to myself."
Mr. Carew groaned faintly, and drew back from the door, which was shut in his face a moment afterwards. Shut and locked. He heard the turning of the key. But even after having excluded her father, Lady Perriam was not destined to be alone. As she locked the door opening on the landing, Celine emerged from the door of communication with the dressing room, where she had been engaged in her daily labours of tidying wardrobes and drawers.
"But, great heaven, madame, how you are pale!" exclaimed the girl, struck by the change in the face which had been so fair an hour ago. "Don't trouble yourself about my looks, but take off these things as quickly as you can."
The girl, who knew nothing of the interrupted wedding, obeyed, wondering not a little, but afraid to question. She took off the pearl grey satin dress, with its priceless Spanish point, 200 years old, the white satin slippers, the muslin underskirts with their ruchings of Brussels lace, all the costly adornment upon which her mistress had bestowed such interest a few days ago. Sylvia flung them from her now with a shudder of aversion, as if they had been more loathsome than Cinderella's rags. Celine was about to unfasten the slender gold chain which held Edmund's last gift, the diamond cross.
"Leave that where it is," said Sylvia, stopping the girl's hand. "I shall wear that till I die."
"Is it possible that madame's mind wanders a little?" mused Celine.
"Now, give me the plainest dress I have,"
said Sylvia, when all the bridal finery had been taken away.
"But, madame, there is the travelling dress all ready for you to put on. The dove colour and blue, the bonnet the veriest gem. Mademoiselle Marchette said it was an inspiration. Why not the travelling dress?"
"Be good enough to do as I bid you.
Give me my black cashmere." "The mourning dress? But, madame, to go into black again after the wedding, it would bring you misfortune."
A look from Lady Perriam stopped the girl's tongue. She brought the sombre mourning dress, which made Sylvia's face seem a shade more ghastly than it had done before.
"That will do," said Sylvia. "And now you can go. Tell the household my marriage has been put off, perhaps only till to-morrow, possibly still longer. You will see that my father has everything that he asks for. I want a few hours' rest, and shall lie down. Don't disturb me till Mr. Standen calls this afternoon." "Mr. Standen is going to call. They have not quarrelled, then," thought Celine. "What can have happened to make her look so awful?"
She ran downstairs to discuss this strange event with Mrs. Stringfold, as they had discussed the course of their mistress's brief courtship. The other servants in the house were strangers with whom Celine had no sympathy. They were left to wonder and speculate among themselves, while Mrs. Stringfold and Celine discoursed in the nursery with closed doors, and a cold chicken and a bottle of champagne from the marriage feast wherewithal to regale themselves.
"I don't believe there'll be any wedding breakfast at all," said Celine. "She wouldn't look as she does if the marriage was only put off for a day. There's something deeper than that." "I never thought no good would come of it from the moment we went among them foreigners," said Mrs. Stringfold with conviction. "There must be something altogether wrong about people when their own native land isn't large enough for 'em."
Sylvia sat alone in her misery, sat in the centre of the room, motionless, like a lifeless figure that had been put there. The broad midday sun streamed in at the window opposite her. The ruthless sun which shines alike upon the just and the unjust, the happy and the despairing. Once she lifted her eyes to that glad summer sky, and thought how the sunlight and summer of her life had passed away for ever.
"I have tried to be fortunate as well as happy, tried to have all good things," she reflected, "and in trying for too much have lost all. I should have been a happy woman if I had been contented with a reasonable share of fortune, satisfied in having won Edmund's love, ready to fight the battle of life with him."
She remembered her father's words on the night of Sir Aubrey's first visit to the schoolhouse. "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune."
"I took that tide at the flood," she thought, "and it has drifted me to ruin."
She sat for an hour without change of attitude, and in that hour the vision of days that were gone passed before her like an unfolded scroll, a bitter retrospect, the picture of a life in which self had reigned supreme, and which had ended in deepest self-abasement. She awakened from that long reverie at last, looked at her watch, found it was later than she had thought, hurriedly put on her bonnet and mantle, the crape bonnet with its large veil and narrow fold of white, the mark of widowhood, the loose cashmere mantle. Dressed thus, with her veil down, she was not likely to attract notice. She took all the money she possessed, and her diamond necklace, out of her jewel box, and put them into a small morocco bag. This bag was all she took with her. She opened the boudoir door, went out upon the landing, and listened. All was perfectly still in the house. She went downstairs, past the nursery, where she heard the voices of Celine and Stringfold in earnest converse, went by with hardly a sigh of regret for her child, crossed the hall, opened the street door softly, and slipped out. Once in the street she flew along with light footsteps, turned the corner of the crescent into a wide and busy road, hailed the first cab she saw, and stepped into it. "Drive to the London Bridge Station," she said. "Brighton line." She knew there were several ways of getting to France, and that one way was by Newhaven and Dieppe. If she were followed, her pursuers would most likely take it for granted she had gone by the Dover and Calais route. By choosing the slower journey she would have a chance of escaping them, supposing that anyone took the trouble to follow her, supposing that anyone guessed she had gone to France. At the station Lady Perriam found that there was a train which would start for Lewes in half an hour, and that she could get on with some little delay to Newhaven, but at Newhaven she would have to wait till late in the evening before the boat started for Dieppe. She had no definite purpose in this flight, no plan for the future. No distant ray of hope beckoned her on. She only wanted to escape the shame of the present, not to hear Edmund's voice accusing and renouncing her, not to be brought face to face with her sin. She wanted to go to some corner of the earth and die, nameless and alone. That self-love which had been the governing principle of her existence was just strong enough, even in her despair, to prompt her to provide herself with the jewels and money which would serve to sustain the life that had become hateful. The train carried her to Lewes, where she had to wait a weary hour and a half before another train took her on to New Haven. A dismal pause, in which that solemn scroll whereon her past life was recorded again unfolded itself, and again she thought how sweet her days might have been had she asked for less, had she been content to take her lot in blind submission from the urn of fate, instead of trying to improve upon destiny. All that day she had eaten nothing, and for many past days had lived in a perpetual fever of hope and fear, always vaguely dreading that something which might happen to frustrate her scheme of the future, never able to repose in the calm assurance that Providence would rule her life for the best. By the time she took her place in the New Haven train, faintness increased almost to exhaustion. A mist dimmed her eyes, her limbs felt heavy and painful, the landscape surged before her like a troubled sea. She had just strength to get out of the railway carriage to follow a porter to the hotel, but she had scarcely entered the sitting-room to which a chambermaid conducted her when she fell fainting to the ground. The landlady was summoned, and hearing that the unconscious traveller had no luggage and no attendant, was only mildly sympathetic. "You had better get her to bed, Jane, and send for the doctor," said the hostess, after various restoratives had been tried without effect. "She seems very bad." End of chapters 61 and 62. Chapters 63 and 64 of Taken at the Flood, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 63. A Voyage of Discovery. Mr. Bayne and his companion drove to the Great Northern Railway in silence, took their tickets for Hatfield, and started in the midday train with as brief exchange of words as was possible between them. In the railway carriage each gentleman had his newspaper, and each pretended to read it. One, the accuser, was cool enough, and was even able to take some interest in the markets and corn exchange and other subjects that affected his own prosperity. He knew what lay before him. He was working out a scheme that had been deliberately concocted. He had sworn to have one of two things: Lady Perriam for his wife, or revenge. That Lady Perriam would ever be his wife seemed now beyond all hope. But he was going to have his revenge, and he was not ill satisfied with himself. Nor would self-interest be sacrificed in the indulgence of this fierce desire of unregenerate mankind. If he could prove Sylvia Perriam the criminal he believed her to be, he must needs remain the sole guardian of her child. There was no one to dispute that office with him, and the Court of Chancery would have no ground for ousting him. During Sir St. John's years of tutelage, he, Shadrach Bayne, would be to all intents and purposes master of the Perriam estates. To him, therefore, this journey was not a journey of despair. Yet some emotion the man must needs feel, if he was not a mere mechanical figure made of some hard metal. He did feel a certain movement of the heart, a dim sense of the awfulness of his errand. All that had happened to-day, Lady Perriam's horror-stricken countenance, her undisguised despair, her piteous entreaty to Edmund not to go with him to the madhouse, all tended to confirm Mr. Bayne in his belief that Sir Aubrey's death had been Sylvia's work, and that the prisoner to be unearthed to-day knew of the crime, and would proclaim it, were his lips unsealed. "I know what Joseph Ledlam is, pretty well," mused Mr. Bayne, "and I know that he'd lend himself to the concealment of the vilest crime that was ever done upon earth if he was paid well enough for his silence. It shall be my task to let the light in upon his snug little home. Lady Perriam reckoned upon too much when she fancied she could make use of a tool of my providing." Edmund sat in silence behind his paper, thinking deeply, but not so much of what lay before him as of that strange scene in the vestry. Vainly did he strive to account for Sylvia's agitation upon any ground consistent with innocence. The despairing accents of her farewell still rang in his ear. Had she been guiltless, would she have feared his desertion? Could she, who knew the depth of his love, suppose that their parting would be final? Yet if guilty, what was the nature of her guilt? That it was the hideous crime suggested by Shadrach Bayne he did not for an instant imagine. Even had he been capable of believing in the infamy of the woman he loved, Sylvia's denial would have assured him of her innocence at least upon this one point. Truth had spoken in her tones. Truth had glorified her countenance in that one supreme moment when, with uplifted eyes and hands raised to heaven, she had asserted her innocence. That she had committed an act of cruelty and injustice in sending Mordred Perriam to the dreary imprisonment of a private lunatic asylum was just possible, and that she was smitten with shame at the revealment of this wrong. Alas! Edmund Stanton knew but too well that this enchantress, for whose sake he had made so many sacrifices, was not altogether stainless; that she was not free from the taint of selfishness. She might have been glad to get rid of a troublesome dependent, to clear her house of a tiresome old man; she might so far be culpable. What should he do if he found that it was so; that she had allowed eccentricity to be treated as lunacy; that she had betrayed the trust left her by her husband, and had needlessly banished Mordred from the house of his forefathers? What should he do? Blame, reprove, and then forgive her; take her to his heart again, with all her errors on her head, and make it the business and duty of his life to reform and elevate her character? This was the lover's resolve. He would set right the wrong she had done, and then forgive her. Even her sin should not part them. At Hatfield Mr. Bayne hired a fly, and after a good deal of talk with the driver contrived to make him understand the direction in which he required to be conveyed. At first the flyman asserted that he never heard tell of no place within 20 miles called the Arbor; but after profound rumination, and after scratching his stubby hairs a little, opined that he did remember having had such a place pointed out to him on Hankers Heath, and "might it be a house where they took folks that was a trifle cranky?" "That is the place," replied Mr. Bayne. "Drive us there as fast as you can." "It's a 7-mile drive," remarked the man dubiously. 14 mile there and back, and my fare will be 14 shillings. I shall not dispute your fare." "And I shall want somethink for myself." "If you drive quickly there and back, I'll give you £1," said Edmund, eager to end the discussion. "Very well, sir. You can't say fairer than that. Jump in. Only it's just as well to avide disputes afterwards, yer see, and it's a wicked road betwixt here and Hankers Heath." The man drove off at a smartish pace, and the occupants of his vehicle were soon made acquainted with the wickedness of the road. Noble prospects and rustic beauty may abound in the environs of Hatfield, but the road to the Arbor hugged the ugliness of the land. It lay in narrow lanes, and by the margent of waste patches of level swamp, where the sour land grew nothing but rush or thistle, dock or dandelion; by black and dismal water pools; by scrubby groves of bare and stunted trees; by meandering ditches across which pollard willows leaned sidelong, extending scraggy arms like the octopus; such a landscape as that in which Macbeth and Banquo met the weird sisters. Yet no. Scotland would not furnish such small and insignificant ugliness. Her dreariest landscape owns the grandeur of size. Over her most dismal plains the shadow of some distant mountain looms in rugged nobility, and the wind from wild deer walks rushes across the barren level like the breath of the great goddess Nature. The scenery grew more hopelessly barren as the travellers approached the end of their journey. Hankers Heath was a desolate flat, whose dull surface of sodden turf was varied here and there by a ragged furze bush or a patch of stagnant water, here and there enlivened by a despondent-looking donkey dragging some clog or fetter at its hind leg; a convict donkey, condemned to penal servitude for life, if one might judge by his look and manner. On one side of the heath was a narrow road, and along this the flyman drove till he came to a gate in a dilapidated fence, behind which appeared the windows of a square plaster-fronted house, which may have originally belonged to some tenant farmer in a small way, a house to which neither wealth nor taste had added a single charm, the barest shell of a habitation, less habitable looking than a gypsy's tent. "This is the place I've heerd folks call the Arbor," said the flyman, pointing to the dwelling with a disparaging turn of his whip. In confirmation of his statement appeared an inscription in white paint on the slate-coloured door: "The Arbor, Dr. Ledlam." "Wait for us," said Mr. Bayne to the driver, as he and his companion alighted. "Now, Mr. Standen," he said, turning to Edmund, while they waited for the opening of the gate, "it is for you or for me to get this old man's secret out of him. That he has a secret, and one that will criminate Lady Perriam, is a fact upon which I am ready to stake every farthing I have in the world." "I am here to see the bottom of your scheme, sir," answered Edmund sternly. "I believe nothing you assert. I admit nothing. I am here as Lady Perriam's future husband, to see her righted." "You had better see Mordred Perriam righted first," returned Mr. Bayne, with a sneer. The door was opened after some delay by a slovenly maid-servant who seemed loath to admit the visitors. It was not till Mr. Bayne had told her that he and his companion were friends of Lady Perriam's that she abandoned her jealous guardianship of the threshold, and let them pass into the garden. Such a garden! A waste of weeds and mould and rough moss-grown gravel; a patch of grass that might once have been a smiling lawn; a damp and ancient willow weeping over a shrunken pond, on whose muddy bosom 2 dirty ducks disported themselves; a wilderness of pot-herbs on one side, where the cheap and fertile scarlet runner ruled dominant, and the vegetable marrow sprawled its tough tendrils and flung its bloated yellow gourds upon the weedy waste. "I don't know as master will allow you to see Mr. Perham," said the girl, "but I'll ask, if you'll be so good as to step into the drawing-room." The visitors complied with this request, and were forthwith ushered into an apartment which made some pretension to gentility. The walls were blotched with damp and stained with mildew. The atmosphere was earthy, but the circular table boasted a gaily coloured cover, and was further adorned with a green glass inkstand, a papier-mâché blotting-book, and a photograph album. An ancient cottage piano stood against one wall, a feeble old sofa faced it, a cheap print or two hinted at Dr. Ledlam's taste for art. The room was in rigid order, and was evidently held sacred to the reception of visitors. Here the steward and Edmund Standen waited for about a quarter of an hour, which seemed longer to both. There were footsteps in the room above, and a running up and down stairs, which might indicate confusion, and preparation of some kind, but Mr. Ledlam did not appear. "Are these people going to keep us here all day?" exclaimed Edmund impatiently. He went over to the fireplace and rang the bell, not an easy thing to do, for the wire was loose, and his first efforts only produced a distant jangling sound. "What a house!" he exclaimed. "What desolation and decay in everything!" This aspect of misery grieved his soul. It would be harder now to forgive Sylvia's sin. That she had placed her brother-in-law under medical restraint, deprived him of actual liberty, he, Edmund Standen, might have schooled himself to pardon. But he had expected to find her victim surrounded by all temporal comforts, in the care of a medical man of position and reputation, whose name alone would be a guarantee for the patient's good treatment. To find him here, in this abode of misery, in a house on which abject poverty had set its mark. This was indeed a blow, and the young man, he who a few hours ago had been a proud and happy lover, turned his back upon Shadrach Bayne, and shed bitter tears at the thought of that callous selfishness which had abandoned a harmless old man to such an existence as life in Dr. Ledlam's rural retreat. No answer came to the bell. There was a window down to the ground, opening directly on the weedy patch that had once been a lawn. "I'll wait no longer," exclaimed Mr. Standen impatiently. "I'll explore this wretched hole for myself. You can come with me or not, as you please, Mr. Bayne." The maid-servant appeared at the door just as Edmund opened the window. "Oh, if you please, sir," she said with a gasp, "I'm very sorry, but I made a mistake in allowing you to come in. Mrs. says Mr. Ledlam is up in London attending to his business there, and it's against his rule for patients' friends to be admitted without an appointment, except it's the friend which placed the patient in his care. And if you'll please to write and ask for an appointment, Mr. Ledlam will let you know when you can see Mr. Perham, providing you has Lady Perham's leaf. Mr. Ledlam holding hisself responsible to Lady Perham, and no one else." The girl stumbled slowly through this message, which had evidently been laboriously imprinted upon her mind, for she tried back when she had finished, and went over a good bit of it again, like a musical box. "I'll ask for an appointment by and by," answered Edmund. "But while I'm here I'll take a look round your place." "Oh, if you please, sir, you mustn't go out into the garden," said the girl with a frightened look. "It's against the rules." "Come, Mr. Bayne," said Edmund, heedless of this remonstrance. He went out of the window, followed by the steward.
"Oh, if you please, you mustn't," gasped the girl, in much alarm; and then, finding her appeal unheeded, she rushed out of the room and tore upstairs, crying, "Missus, missus, they've gone out into the garding, and Mr. Pierham's there with Sammy, in the preambulator."
64. Mr. Ledlam's Patient. Mr. Stanton's first act on getting out into the open was to take a survey of the house, thinking that Mr. Ledlam's prisoner might in all probability be looking out of one of the windows. But the windows were all blank. 2 of the upper casements were guarded by bars, doubtless with the view of preventing the escape of any desperate patient who might be inclined to emulate Jack Sheppard's evasion from Newgate. "Come round the garden," said Mr. Bayne. "From that girl's anxiety I'll be bound he's somewhere out here." They crossed the grass to the stagnant pond where ducks and duckweed flourished, and where the ancient willow wept the desolation of the scene. That willow was the one bit of shelter in all that arid waste of garden, and between the drooping branches Mr. Bayne's keen eye had discerned some object that looked like a human figure. He made for this spot, therefore, followed closely by Edmund. The willow was on the opposite side of the water. They went quickly round the edge of the pool, Mr. Bayne always in advance. Yes, there was someone under the tree. A child's shrill voice sounded as they approached, an old man's piping tones answering. Mr. Bayne parted the willow branches and looked into the natural arbour. An old man was seated in a dilapidated wheel-chair, an infant by his side in an equally dilapidated perambulator, and both these helpless objects were under the care of a tall, lanky-looking girl of about 11 years old. Shadrach Bayne, not wont to display violent emotion, drew back with a loud cry, and the ruddy tints of his sunburnt face faded to a sickly white. "Sir Aubrey Perriam!" he exclaimed aghast. "What do you mean?" cried Edmund, seizing the agent by the shoulder. Mr. Bayne did not answer him, but crept under the willow and bent over the old man, taking his hand and looking into his face. "Sir Aubrey, don't you know me? I'm your old steward, Shadrach Bayne, come to fetch you out of this wretched hole, come to take you back to life." "Yes, to life," answered the old man in senile tones. "They made believe I was dead. They told me to my face that I was not Aubrey, but Mordred. They put me in Mordred's rooms, and kept me shut up there, and told me it would be worse for me if I called myself Sir Aubrey Perriam." "Who was it that did this?" with a pained look and a wilder tone. "Not my wife? Oh, no, not my wife. Not my pretty Sylvia. She was beautiful and good. She could never have been so cruel to me." "Never mind who did it, Sir Aubrey. It is all over now. No one will dare to deny your name when I am by your side. Good God! What a scheme for a woman to invent! For a woman to execute! I see it all now. It was Mordred who died, and that woman made the world believe it was her husband. I wish you joy of your plighted wife, Mr. Stanton," added the agent, turning to Edmund, who leaned against the tree white as death. The old man clung to Shadrach Bayne, like a child who has been restored to the nurse he loves. "Yes, I know, he muttered. "You are Bayne, a good servant, a faithful servant. Take me away from this place, this dull, cold, cheerless place. They don't beat me, they're not very unkind to me, but they're poor, and everything is comfortless. Carter was always good, but she is ill now, and I'm left with Sammy and Clara calls me Mr. Perriam, and laughs at me when I tell her my right name is Sir Aubrey." Clara was the tall girl who stood behind the wheel-chair knitting a baby's sock. "That's his fancy," she said sharply. "When he first went out of his mind he took it into his head that he was his elder brother, the one that died. It was his brother's death that turned his brain, father says." "His brain is no more turned upon some points than yours, my girl," answered Mr. Bayne. "His intellect was weakened by a stroke of paralysis, but he's clear enough at times. He has been used very badly, and I mean to take him away from here without loss of time." "You can't do that," said the girl promptly. "Father won't let you." "I shall not ask your father's leave," replied Shadrach Bayne. "You'll stand by me, won't you, Mr. Stanton?" Yes, I will do what I can to see this poor old man righted," answered Edmund gloomily. "What is the matter with Mrs. Carter, the nurse?" asked Mr. Bayne.
Inflammation of the lungs. She was took bad a fortnight ago, and father got her round a bit at first, but he says the cough has settled on her chest, and she'll never get over it. She's awful bad. We were afraid last night she'd hardly have lived till this morning."
"If you want to know the particulars of this business, you'd better stop and question Mrs. Carter," said Mr. Bayne to Edmund. "She has been in it from first to last. She was Lady Perriam's prime confidant and adviser." "I'll see her," answered Edmund, "unless you want my help in getting Sir Aubrey away." He had been gazing at the old man's face with earnest scrutiny, to assure himself that this was indeed the elder and not the younger brother, that he was not being made the dupe of some juggling of Mr. Bayne's. That scrutiny left no doubt in his mind. This was verily Sir Aubrey Perriam, Sylvia's husband. Strong as had been the resemblance between the brothers, there was just sufficient individuality in the face to make Edmund Stanton very sure upon this point, though he had seen Mordred but once in his life. "I only want you to go as far as the carriage with us," said Mr. Bayne, "and then you can return and see Mrs. Carter. But don't commit yourself by any promise to condone her share in this conspiracy. If she is dying, it can matter little whether her crime is condoned. But it is just possible she may be no nearer death than I am. We can get Sir Aubrey to the gate in this chair. He used to be able to walk a little, but perhaps he's weaker now. It will be easy to lift him into the carriage between us. I shall take him to an hotel at Hatfield, and keep him there till he can be moved comfortably back to Perriam."
"But you mustn't take him away," shrieked Miss Ledlam. "I'll run and tell mother."
She sped off on this somewhat futile errand, leaving the baby squalling in the perambulator, appalled by the sudden solitude. When she came back, followed by Mrs. Ledlam, a timid-looking matron, who had been all this time trying to make herself presentable to the eye of strangers, with the assistance of a good many too obvious pins and a clean collar, Sir Aubrey and Mr. Bayne had just driven off in the fly, and Edmund Stanton was quietly approaching the house.
"He's gone, Mar!"
screamed Clara.
"They've took him clean away."
Mrs. Ledlam began to cry.
"Your father will say it's my fault," she moaned piteously. "But what could I do? I wasn't fit to be seen when they came, and was just getting myself a little bit tidy when you ran in to say they were going. And there's all our income gone at one swoop, for he was your pa's only patient after we lost young Hicks, the grocer's son. And goodness knows when he'll get another. I'm sure I tremble when I think what he'll say to me." "It wasn't your fault, Mar. You couldn't have stopped them if you had been dressed ever so. They'd have taken him away by main force. There's one of the gentlemen coming this way. You'd better ask him what they meant by it."
Mr. Stanton, being timorously interrogated upon this point, would give no definite answer. "There has been a great wrong done," he said gravely. "I cannot tell what knowledge your husband may have had of that wrong, but I know that the first step toward setting it right was to get that poor old man out of this house."
"I'm sure he's been treated kindly," whimpered Mrs. Ledlam, "and if he says he isn't, he's a deceiving old thing. He's had every indulgence. Sago puddings that I've made for him with my own hands, and mutton broth, and all kinds of delicacies. I'm sure he's been treated like the family, and we've all of us borne with his worrying nonsense, when he said he was not himself but his brother. Clara has had the patience of an angel with him."
Mr. Stanton asked to see the nurse, Mrs. Carter, and after some difficulty, by means of a good deal of persuasion and the gift of a £5 note to Mrs. Ledlam, as consolation under the sudden loss of income, he obtained permission to go up to the attic where the sick woman was lying.
"She's very bad," said Mrs. Ledlam. "I sat up with her half last night, thinking she was going, but it's a harassing, deceiving complaint, and I dare say she'll go on lingering ever so long, a burden to herself and others."
Mrs. Carter, otherwise Mrs. Carford, lay on her narrow bed facing the casement, through which the westering sun streamed with soft yellow light. She was the very shadow, the pale ghost of that Mrs. Carter who had been seen at Perriam a month ago. The bright brown eyes looked larger than of old, larger than they had seemed even in her days of semi-starvation, when she came a suppliant to Headingham schoolhouse. Yet even now, with that deadly brightness, they were like Sylvia's eyes. Edmund perceived the resemblance at once. He sat quietly down by the bedside and took her hand. She looked at him at first with a dull indifference, thinking he was some strange doctor who had been brought to see her. Then a gleam of recognition flashed into her eyes. She remembered a face she had seen in a photograph Sylvia had shown her, the face of her daughter's first lover. "Is Lady Perriam here?" she asked. "No, but if there is anything on your mind, anything you wish to tell before you are called away, you need not fear to tell me. Whatever wrong you have done is now past atonement upon earth. Try to secure God's pity by a late repentance. Do not carry the secret of your sin to the grave." "The wrong I did was not done for my own sake, but for another. If I tell the truth, it is she who will suffer. If you are speaking of Lady Perriam, be assured that nothing you can tell me can affect her injuriously. In the first place, her secret is already known, and in the second place, I should be the last to use any knowledge to her disadvantage." "What, is it known already?" cried Mrs. Carter, agitated. "I knew it must come to light sooner or later, that such a sinful thing could not long be hidden. But so soon? That it should all be discovered so soon? How did it happen? Who came here?" "Do not trouble yourself about details. You are too weak to bear much emotion. Sir Aubrey has been found, and he is in safe hands. Let that content you." "And she, Lady Perriam, are you so deeply interested in her welfare?" "More deeply than you can imagine," answered Mrs. Carter with a sigh. "You are related to her, perhaps. I saw a likeness in your face to hers the moment I entered this room." "We are related by the nearest tie that kindred owns. Lady Perriam is my daughter." "What! You are the mother of whom she spoke to me with such affection, for whose sake she married Sir Aubrey Perriam?" "Did she tell you that?" "Yes. She told me that you were in abject poverty, almost starving, and that her only chance of helping you was by a marriage with a rich man." "It was true. I was in abject poverty, and after her marriage she relieved me with an occasional remittance. But I have every reason to believe that at that time she was ignorant of our relationship. I accepted her alms as an act of pure benevolence from one who knew not that I was more to her than a stranger." "But she did help you?" "She did; and when she had the opportunity of giving me lasting employment and a home as Sir Aubrey's nurse, she sent for me." "She employed you as a servant in her house?" "Yes. The position was one of servitude, but she did not make it degrading. I lived apart from the other servants, and I was near her. That to me was exquisite happiness until—" "Until what?" "Until she tempted me to aid her in a sinful act, a wicked act, which poisoned my life and hers. You, of all men, should be merciful in your judgment of her, for it was her fatal love for you that urged her to commit that sin." "May God deal as mercifully with her as my thoughts," said Edmund, deeply moved. "You will think less hardly of her, perhaps, if you know all. But it is a wicked story, and I hate myself for the weakness that made me help in that evil work. Since I have been in this house, with the fear of death before my eyes, I have written an account of all that happened at Perriam Place. Dare I trust you as a Roman Catholic would trust his father confessor? Will you promise to make no use of that information against Sylvia?" "Against her? You do not know how blindly, how utterly I have loved her. If her love for me has been fatal, mine has been fatal too, and it has been thorough, which hers never was. Whatever power I have to shield her from the consequences of her guilt shall be used to the utmost. But alas, I fear that power is of the smallest." "Where is she now?" "In London with her father." "Lose no more time here, then, but go back to her. Tell her that all is discovered." "She must know that, for she knew where we were coming when we left her this morning. But I will go back and see if I can be of any use, though it will be hard to look upon her face again." "Do not trust her father's kindness in the hour of misfortune. Take my keys and open that desk on the chest of drawers." The feeble hand groped under the pillow and drew out a small bunch of keys. "The smallest key belongs to the desk." Edmund obeyed. "You see a roll of papers?" "Yes." "Take those with you, and go." "Can I not do anything for you? Have you proper medical attendance, good nursing?" "Yes, these people do all they can. But my doom is sealed. Go to her, you may save her from despair." End of chapters 63 and 64. Chapter 65 of Taken at the Flood by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 65. It is the tale which angry conscience tells. Edmund Standen put the roll of paper in his breast pocket and took his leave of the sick woman, wondering at the mother's unselfishness, which even on a deathbed made the thought of a daughter's peril paramount above all personal suffering. Anxious as he felt about Sylvia's fate, he stopped to appeal to Mrs. Ledlam on behalf of the helpless invalid upstairs, volunteering to pay any charges that might be incurred in careful nursing, and to reward kindness by liberal donations. Mrs. Ledlam, who was soft-hearted, wept and promised to do her best. "We'll move her down into Mr. Perriam's room. It's better than where she is. And she shall have every attention, shan't she, Clara?" said Mrs. Ledlam, appealing to the sharp 11-year-old daughter, her eldest hope. "Yes, Mar, I'm willing to do anything. She was ladylike and pleasant, and gave no trouble." "Quite a superior person," said Mrs. Ledlam. "Anyone could see that." Edmund administered another £5 note as an earnest of future favours, and left the dreary arbour to go back to London and to Willoughby Crescent. He had to walk back to Hatfield through the unknown lanes in the deepening dusk, carrying a heavier heart than he had ever known yet. For the pain of Sylvia's desertion 2 years ago seemed light when looked back upon, in comparison with the anguish of knowing her to be the guilty creature she was. He arrived at Willoughby Crescent late in the evening, and here he found Mr. Carew in a wretched and uneasy state. The whole household was disorganized. Lady Perriam had gone, none knew whither. "What is to be done?" asked Mr. Carew helplessly. "I know nothing, have been kept in the dark, treated as a cipher." "She has gone knowing that shame and disgrace were inevitable if she remained," said Edmund, when the father had finished his fretful lamentings. "Perhaps it is better that it should be so. Flight was the only escape possible to her. If she has but found a safe asylum, I am content. I, who have loved her so dearly." But then came the thought of a darker possibility. What if she had rushed out of that house, restless and despairing, to find the surest escape in death? Edmund questioned Celine as to the manner of her mistress's departure. The girl could tell him nothing, except that Lady Perriam had gone, that she must have left the house dressed in her weeds, and could have taken nothing with her except a small morocco bag, which was the only object Celine had missed from the dressing-room. This looked bad, but Edmund did not despair. "She may have taken money in the bag, and money will buy everything. Do you know if she had any money in the house?" "Yes, sir. I have seen a bundle of notes in her jewel case." "Bring me the jewel case." The case was brought. Edmund smashed the lock with a poker, and examined the case in Celine's presence. The money was gone, and the diamonds. Celine knew that both had been in the case on the previous night. "Thank God!" exclaimed Edmund, when he and Mr. Carew were alone. "She has not thought of making away with herself. She would not have taken money and diamonds if she had any idea of suicide." "There's no fear of suicide," replied Mr. Carew calmly. "It doesn't run in our family." There was nothing more to be done. She had escaped all interrogation. She had ample means of maintenance for some time to come. She had done the best for herself. "I do not know that I could have advised anything better if I had been at her side," Edmund thought sadly. "And now she and I are indeed parted. She to be a nameless wanderer, I a desolate, broken-hearted man. My mother was too true a prophet when she told me that my love for Sylvia Carew was fatal." His mother. That name took his thoughts back to Headingham, to the home whose doors he had shut against himself. There lay the bitterest humiliation. To go back, to confess that he had wasted all the passion of his youth upon a worthless woman. "No, I will not call her worthless," he said. "Whatever her sin was, she did all for my sake. My lips shall not condemn her." He left Willoughby Crescent, and went back to that dreariest of all abodes for the dejected, his hotel. Here, after a brief and tasteless meal, the first food he had eaten since 8 o'clock in the morning, he drew the lamp near him and opened Mrs. Carter's manuscript. It was nearly midnight, the house quiet, the servants at rest in their chambers in the Norman Gothic roof, only the night watchman on guard below. Mr. Standen had no fear of interruption in the perusal of these closely written pages, a reading that would doubtless be full of pain. Mrs. Carford's Confession. I write these lines with the knowledge that my troubled life is rapidly drawing to its lonely close, write with the thought and fear of death before my eyes, write because I feel that it is my duty to the living to leave behind me a clear and truthful confession of my sin, even though by so doing I may bring sorrow and shame upon her for whom I sinned, and who is the sole object of my love and pity. I believe that it is better for her peace, on earth and beyond earth, that the truth should be known. The first suffering will be lighter than the last, better for her that her wrong-doing should be revealed while justice may yet be done, while her victim still lives, and some atonement may be made, than later when his life may have been shortened by her sin and atonement may have become impossible. She will say, perhaps, that her mother's sole legacy is shame and grief for her, but let her believe that her mother's last thoughts were full of tenderness for her, and that even in this act of confession, her ultimate peace was the chief object of that unhappy mother's desire. When I first came to Perriam Place, as nurse and attendant to Sir Aubrey Perriam, the change in my mode of existence was so complete that it seemed to me like the beginning of a new life. From the deepest poverty, from the most sordid surroundings, from the ceaseless struggle for daily bread, from a life whose present deprivations were darkened by the shadow of the future, which might bring even worse misery, I found myself suddenly placed in a position of perfect ease and comfort, luxuries that I had not known for years again at my command, my wants provided for without an effort or a thought of mine. All this I owed to Lady Perriam, my benefactress, who had seen me in my distress, and whose benevolence had been enlisted by my abject misery. Lady Perriam, who knew not that the object of her charity was her most unhappy mother. All that was demanded of me in return for these new and manifold blessings was unvarying devotion to my patient. That I conscientiously rendered. I can safely say that for the first year of my residence at Perriam, my duty was never out of my thoughts. I felt for my helpless patient a pity which was almost affection. He was troublesome, he was exacting. My nights were often broken, my days always laborious; but his affliction ensured my compassion, and the study of my life was to lighten the burden of his wearisome existence. Lady Perriam's son was born, my grandson, and his birth awoke a new joy in my heart. It was my most cherished privilege to watch beside the infant's cradle, to hold him in my arms. But this delight I only enjoyed at intervals, and by the favor of the nurse. It was not selfish pleasure alone which I felt in that dear one's birth. I rejoiced for the sake of her who was dearer still, the daughter to whom I never dared to reveal myself, lest she should shrink from me with contempt or aversion. Now, I said to myself, my Sylvia will be happy. If her life has been hitherto purposeless and unhappy, spent in the gloomy silence of this old house, ministering to a husband who is dead in life, now all will be changed. This first-born son will occupy her empty heart, absorb all her thoughts, all her care, become the center of all her hopes. This is what I hoped and believed. And for a little while it seemed as if my hope was to be realized. So long as novelty gave a charm to the endearments of her babe, Sylvia was happy. But even in her happiness I saw with deepest pain that the pleasure she derived from her first-born son was rather the delight of a child in the possession of a new toy than the deep joy of maternity. Little by little she tired of the child's company, complained that he was troublesome, lost her interest in his welfare, and left him more and more to the care of his nurse. Then, indeed, I trembled for my poor child's safety, for I saw that the one influence which would have purified her nature, redeemed it from all its original imperfections, was wanting. I remembered my own wedded life and its guilty close; remembered how, wanting in maternal love, I had torn myself away from my infant daughter, forfeited for ever the right to claim her affection or duty. Time went on, and I saw Sylvia growing sadder and more despondent. She took no pleasure in life. If she came to the sick room and sat by her husband's armchair for a quiet hour in the long day, her restless melancholy air showed that she was performing an irksome duty. Even Sir Aubrey's dull perceptions were sometimes aware of this. "Go away, Sylvia," he would say. "Go, and be happy away from your afflicted husband. Why do you stop in this dull room? It makes me miserable to see your sad face." One night I went to Lady Perriam at a later hour than usual, with a message from Sir Aubrey. I knocked at her dressing room door, and receiving no answer, ventured to open it and go in. She was on her knees on the ground, her head flung upon the sofa cushions, in an attitude of utter self-abandonment, her hands clasped convulsively amongst the loose dishevelled hair, which fell over her shoulders, her whole frame shaken by the violence of her sobs. The sight of her grief made me forget all the restraints of prudence and my supposed position in that house. I knelt beside her, lifted her head and laid it on my bosom, wiped the tears from her pale cheeks, kissed her with a mother's passionate love. "Sylvia," I cried, "Sylvia, my beloved child, what is this secret grief? Confide in me, trust me, not a stranger, but your own mother. In whom should you trust, if not in me?" It was some time before she answered me, and before those convulsive sobs had slowly exhausted themselves. While she was becoming gradually calmer, I told her my own wretched story, briefly, but without sparing myself the record of my own guilt. She received the intelligence with wonderful tranquillity, or rather as if some grief of her own so absorbed her mind that she was hardly capable of feeling surprise. "If you are my mother, you ought to be true to me," she said at last. "Yes, and help me, and stand by me in my hour of need." "Do you think I should ever again forsake you, Sylvia?" I said. "In the sinful years of my youth your childish image haunted me in every hour. Remorse for the wrong I had done you was the bitterest anguish of all I had to suffer. If Heaven gives me an opportunity of atoning for that wrong, I shall not be slow to seize it." "You mean that you would stand by me so long as my acts were such as God and man would approve?" said Sylvia, with a thoughtful look. "But if I went out of the straight course, if I asked you to do something that involved difficulty, or even danger, would you stand by me then?" "Yes, Sylvia, if I could reconcile the act with my own conscience." "Conscience!" exclaimed my daughter, with a sneer. "Since when have you had a conscience?" "From the hour of my wrongdoing. Remorse awakened my sleeping conscience." "Well, mother," she exclaimed, lightly, "I am not going to put your courage or your affection to the test. What could you do to help me? Nothing. You could not lighten my burden by a feather's weight." "I don't think it is a very heavy burden for you to bear, Sylvia. You have all things which the world calls good." "Let the world judge for itself, and not for me," she cried, contemptuously. "I have not the only blessing that could make life happy for me. I have lost the love of the only man I ever cared for." "You must have made up your mind to live without that, Sylvia, when you married Sir Aubrey Perriam." "Oh, I was dazzled, blinded, bewildered by my father's worldly arguments, stung by Mrs. Stanton's insolence. It seemed a grand revenge upon her to marry her son's superior. I forgot that I could not live without Edmund. I did not know my own heart, hardly knew that I had a heart. But I have seen him to day. I passed him in Monkhampton High Street, saw scorn and regret both in his face, and came home to this dreary house, more completely miserable than I have ever been yet." I tried to convince her of the wickedness of these regrets, this useless sorrow, but with no effect. She poured her tale of love and grief into my ear, told me of her brief engagement to Mr. Stanton, his courage, his devotion, and how she had rewarded him by desertion. She humiliated herself to the dust, and though I was compelled to blame, I could not withhold my pity. "Is there any hope of release for me?" she asked at last, looking at me intently with those full bright eyes, which are always most steadfast when there is some evil thought in her mind. "In Sir Aubrey's wretched state he cannot linger long, I should think." "Do not cling to that wicked hope," I answered. "Mr. Stimpson told me only a week ago that Sir Aubrey's health has improved wonderfully within the last few months, and that, although he may never regain clearness of intellect or the active use of his left side, He may live to be a very old man."
"What a burden!" she exclaimed. "A burden to himself and a burden to me. And we are to go dawdling on year after year with the same joyless, objectless existence. When I married I thought I was to lead a life of splendour and pleasure, that the world would teach me to forget my forsaken lover. Do you think I should have been mad enough to enter knowingly upon such a life as this, the life of a convent or a prison? I was 20 times happier at the schoolhouse. If I had only known it," she added, with a profound sigh.
I urged her to do her duty meekly and patiently, so that she might feel the tranquil blessedness of a life well spent. I reminded her of her many advantages, and entreated her to contrast her life with the miserable existences which fill that nethermost world, where poverty reigns supreme. "Be happy that your husband is spared to you, and that by your devotion to him in his declining years, you may prove your gratitude for the affection which has raised you from the village schoolmaster's daughter to be mistress of Perriam Place," I said, appealing to her worldliness as a last resource. "Be kind to him while you have the power. There is one in this house to whom you have not been overkind, and who may soon have passed beyond the reach of human kindness or unkindness." "Whom do you mean?" Sylvia asked eagerly. "Mordred Perriam. He has been slowly fading ever since the shock of his brother's seizure, slipping unawares out of life. He rarely complains, and his descriptions of his malady are so vague and rambling that it is hard to make out the nature of his sufferings. No one ever takes any notice of him. He is of no importance here. A figure always in shadow. I have spoken to Mr. Stimpson more than once about him, but Mr. Stimpson only shrugs his shoulders, and says that Mr. Perriam was always a poor creature, no stamina, organic derangement, will go off some day like the snuff of a candle. Poor fellow! I have done what I can for him, but it is very little." "And do you really think he is dying?" asked Sylvia in a half whisper. "I will not say that, but I believe that his life hangs by the feeblest thread, a thread that may snap at any moment." Sylvia was silent, and seemed lost in thought. "Have you ever noticed the resemblance between Sir Aubrey and his brother?" she asked at last. "It is impossible for anyone to avoid noticing so strong a resemblance. Do you think the likeness has increased since you have been here?" "To a marked degree." "And now one brother might easily be mistaken for the other?" "By a casual observer, perhaps. Not by anyone who was intimate with either of the brothers." "But seen at a distance, or seen for a moment only, or in a half light, one might be mistaken for the other?" "Very easily." I wondered at questions which seemed frivolous and purposeless. Sylvia said no more upon the subject, and dismissed me, after promising to conquer her grief, and to think no more of Edmund Standen. For about 6 weeks life at Perriam went on in the usual way. There was only one change, but that was a marked one. Lady Perriam was a great deal kinder and more attentive to her husband. She spent more of her time in his room, never failed to be by his side when he took his airing on the terrace, read to him, conversed with him, bore with his fretful childish ways, and seemed in everything all that a wife should be. In my foolish blindness I was proud of the change. I thought that my weak words had caused this improvement. Mr. Bayne left England, and about 2 days after his departure Mr. Perriam, who had up to this time been able to shuffle to and fro between his own rooms and his brother's, was utterly prostrated by a kind of low fever which followed a severe cold. I suggested to Lady Perriam that Mr. Stimpson should see her brother-in-law, but she said no, peremptorily. I was a better doctor for such simple ailments than Mr. Stimpson, she told me, and I was to nurse Mr. Perriam. "Mr. Stimpson would give him saline draughts and rob him of the little strength he has left," she said. "You can bring him round again with beef tea and jellies." I obeyed, the illness appearing a very simple one. But I hardly took into account the low ebb to which the patient's strength had fallen. He was not actually confined to his bed, but sat and dozed by the fire in his easy chair. I went into his room, and attended to him as often as I could venture to leave Sir Aubrey, who was always an exacting invalid. Mr. Perriam was all patience, received my attention with gratitude, and thanked me repeatedly in his feeble voice for my care. He asked me to place his chair within reach of some bookshelves close beside the mantelpiece, but placed somewhat high. He could just manage to reach the lowest row of books without rising from his chair. Though too weak to read more than a few minutes at a stretch, it amused him to take down the books and turn the leaves, reading a line here and there. He had remained in this state for 2 days, growing neither better nor worse, and I saw no reason for apprehension, feeble as I knew him to be. Late on the evening of the second day I left Lady Perriam's dressing-room to take Mordred a basin of broth for his supper. It was between 10 and 11, the servants were all gone to bed, Jean Chapelain having retired early, complaining of gout. I had strong reason to suspect that this pretended gout was only a disguise for nightly intoxication. Chapelain's services in the sick-room had long been of the feeblest order. He assisted at his master's morning toilette, read a French novel to him occasionally, and sometimes appeared at 10 o'clock to assist in putting Sir Aubrey to bed. For the rest of the evening he generally contrived to be missing. All was quiet in Sir Aubrey's room when I left Sylvia to go to Mr. Perriam. The baronet had gone to bed earlier than usual, to suit the convenience of Chapelain, and was sleeping peacefully. I went through the passage of communication to Mr. Perriam's room. He sat in the armchair where I had left him, beside the wood fire, the ruddy blaze of the logs shining full upon him. At the first glance which I cast towards that motionless figure I uttered a cry of fear, and hurried forward, setting down the broth basin hastily as I passed the table. His head was thrown back upon the pillow I had placed to support it. One arm was raised above the head, but hung loose and nerveless. An open book lay on the pillow beside the drooping gray head. Mordred Perriam was dead. He might have died any time within the last hour. Only an hour ago I had arranged his pillows, and given him his dose of weak brandy and water. It was clear to me that he had raised himself to reach that volume from one of the higher shelves, and that even this slight exertion had been enough to snap the feeble thread of life. While I stood gazing at him in pained astonishment, a light step approached me, and looking round, I saw Lady Perriam standing on the other side of the hearth, arrested spellbound, perhaps by the aspect of that quiet figure in the armchair. "What has happened?" she asked. "Mr. Perriam is dead." "No, not Mr. Perriam. Sir Aubrey is dead. Mr. Perriam may survive him for many years." Never had I heard her tone more decided. Never had I seen such a look of decision in her pale set face. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that the time has come for you to stand by me, and help me as you promised you would do when the time should come. I do not ask any desperate act from you. I only ask you to help me and be true to me. Sir Aubrey is dead in life, almost as dead as yonder corpse. What can it matter to him what name he bears in his living grave? What need he care whether he is called Aubrey or Mordred? As Mordred he would have the same care, the same indulgence, not a desire of his feeble mind ungratified." "What madness is this?" I exclaimed. "You can never dream of attempting to substitute this dead man for your living husband." "That is exactly what I do mean," she answered resolutely. "It matters nothing to that paralytic old man whether he is nominal master of Perriam or not, whether he occupies one set of rooms or another. But it matters a great deal to me to be free from the hateful bondage that chains me to this dreary house, to be Sir Aubrey's widow instead of his wife." I need not record my remonstrances. All that a mother could say to dissuade her child from a desperate and wicked act I said, not once, but with passionate despairing iteration. Sylvia held firmly to her purpose, and told me with every appearance of a fixed resolve, that if I refused to help her in this vile scheme, refused to set her free, as she called it, she would make away with herself before the dawn of tomorrow's light. She was utterly weary of her life, and would endure it no longer, if she lost this one chance of freedom. At last, in weakness and despair, I consented to an act which has poisoned my life with the bitterness of useless remorse. In the dead of the night, when all the house was wrapped in sleep, we contrived with infinite labor and trouble to remove Sir Aubrey on a couch from his own apartments to his brother's, dragging that heavy couch along the passage with as little sound as was possible, yet not without sufficient noise to have betrayed us had any of the household slept at that end of the house. Fate favored my daughter's crime, for we had the east wing entirely to ourselves, and there was little fear of our movements being overheard. Lady Perriam acted with a presence of mind and energy that knew no limit. It was an opiate of her administering which enabled us to remove Sir Aubrey to his new quarters. It was her quick intelligence which arranged every detail of that evil work. Before daybreak all was over, and Mordred Perriam lay upon Sir Aubrey's bed, his limbs composed in the last awful slumber, his beard and hair arranged so as to increase his likeness to the baronet, and that likeness stronger in death than it had ever been in life. End of chapter 65. Chapters 66 and 67 of Taken at the Flood by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 66. Sir Aubrey's Return. There was more in Mrs. Carford's manuscript, but what remained told only of her difficult service with the victim of that conspiracy in which she had been an unwilling actor. She described the misery of long and weary days spent with the invalid, who at times was fully conscious of the wrong that had been done him, and asserted his identity and his claims as master of Perriam Place with vehemence and insistence, while at other times he lapsed into a state of dull indifference, vacant-minded, unconscious of anything beyond his physical comfort, his dinner, his wine, the temperature of his rooms, the warmth of his garments. In every stage of his feelings Mrs. Carford was at hand, patient, unfailing, his comforter and friend, and to her in his lighter moments he clung with sincere affection. His guilty wife never approached him, shrinking from him with as deep a horror as if the quiet room where he sat had been the chamber of death. Mrs. Carford neglected no care, left no duty undone, that might lighten the burden of that joyless life. This ceaseless labor, this continual anxiety, she accepted meekly as her penance for the errors of her past life. Her deepest sorrow was for her daughter's guilt. Her never-ending fear was for that day of retribution which she felt convinced must come sooner or later to the sinner. All this was recorded at length in the manuscript which Sylvia's mother had given to Edmund Standen. He rose from the perusal of that paper with the feeling that every hope and desire of his life had ended. Existence lay before him a blank and sunless waste to be traversed, every star that had once lighted and beautified the distance extinguished forever. What was he to do with his life henceforward? Go back to Monkhampton, resume his situation in the bank, work for his daily bread, live through all the scandal that would follow the revelation of Sylvia's crime, see the woods of Perriam Place in the distance, and be reminded every day how she, whom he loved so fondly, was banished forever from that scene, in deepest disgrace and shame, existing only as a nameless wanderer, none knew where? No, he could not return. That question was decided easily enough. He had £200 in hand, money he had saved from his salary, his wants and his mother's house being very few. He would go abroad, wander far from the scene of his disappointments for a year or so, and when he came back to England he would get a situation, either in London or one of the northern counties, where he would find himself among strangers who would never torture his ears with the name of Sylvia Perriam. It would be easy now for him to get employment in any English bank, with such testimonials as he could obtain from the chiefs of the Western Union. He wrote to Mr. Sanderson, the Monkhampton manager, touched briefly on the trouble that had changed all his plans, surrendered his position in the bank, and engaged Mr. Sanderson's friendship in the future, when he should have occasion to obtain a new employment. He wrote also to Mrs. Standen, telling her in the simplest words, without passion or self-abasement, how cruel a disappointment had overtaken the hopes that had made him an exile from his home. He acknowledged that this blow seemed like retribution for his dishonored vows to Esther, but he put forward no plea for forgiveness, he hinted at no hope for the future. He told his mother that, dear though she must ever be to him, his life was likely to be spent far from Dean House. "I shall come to you gladly whenever you may summon me, my dear mother," he wrote, "but I shall only come in obedience to your summons, and I never again can enter Dean House except as a guest. You will say, and rightly, that I have fooled away all my chances of happiness; but you shall never have occasion to say that I am leading an unmanly or dishonorable life. I am going on the Continent again to try and forget this latest grief amidst unfamiliar scenes. My career after my return to England will be one of honorable industry, and however you may blame your son for his past errors, with God's help you shall have no cause to blush for him in the future." These 2 letters dispatched, Edmund Stanton felt that he had but one more duty to do. That duty was to provide for Mrs. Carford's declining days. She was helpless, friendless, dying, and anxious as he was to leave England, he could not go without doing all that benevolence could do to ensure the peace of her last hours. He took a famous physician down to Henker's Heath, to ascertain whether Mrs. Carford could safely be moved to more comfortable quarters; but the doctor told him decisively that any attempt to remove the patient would only precipitate the inevitable end. She was dying. Tender and skillful nursing might alleviate the sufferings of her last hours; it could do no more. Edmund made all necessary arrangements, took all charges upon himself, and remained at a village inn in the immediate neighbourhood of Mr. Ledlam's cheerless abode, in order to ensure the patient's welfare by frequent visits to the arbour. He had not long to wait for the melancholy end. Before the week was over, Mrs. Carford's troubled life had reached its penitent close. James Carford was summoned ere the end, and came in time to breathe words of forgiveness into the dying woman's ear, and to implore pardon for his own unkindness and neglect, which he confessed might have done much to influence his wife's conduct. "We were both to blame, I dare say," he said, "and I may have been the worse sinner." James Carford and Edmund Stanton returned to London together after the quiet funeral in the village churchyard. During the journey Mr. Carford, alias Carew, took occasion to inform Mr. Stanton of the abject position to which his daughter's misfortunes had reduced him. "I have been living like a gentleman for the last 2 years," he said, "and now I find myself brought face to face with starvation. My daughter had no thought of my destitute position when she fled, with all the property at her command. Unless I can join her in her exile, I know not what is to become of me." "You need not fear starvation," answered Edmund. "I have forfeited the inheritance that would have been mine for your daughter's sake, and must henceforward work for my living; but I am not afraid to promise you £50 a year for the rest of your life, and that income will save you from starvation." "You are too good, Mr. Stanton. Ah, if my unfortunate child had but seen things more clearly! How much happier for her to have been your wife, than to have bartered peace for splendor! You forget, Mr. Carew, that you rejected my offer with contempt. Pardon that act of folly, Mr. Stanton. Remember how little I knew of you. I saw before me only a foolish young man, over head and ears in love; rash, impetuous, ready to sacrifice his prospects, and involve the object of his affections in his own ruin. Had I known your steadfast and noble character, your power to win a position for yourself, I should have been the last to hesitate. However, it is worse than idle to regret past errors. Poor Sylvia! Would to heaven I knew where to find her!" Edmund sighed and looked out of the window. Guilty Sylvia! His heart bled for her, worthless though she was. If she had sinned against him in the beginning, her last and heaviest sin had been committed for his sake. Hard if he had not pitied her. "Those diamonds," mused Mr. Carew, "they must have been worth £3,000 or £4,000. And that poor child wandering alone and unprotected, when she might at least have had a father's care." He thought of that noble income, that splendid home, which Sylvia had lost by an act of guilt and folly that seemed to him unparalleled in the history of woman's wrongdoing. Not long had Mr. Carew been permitted to enjoy the luxuries of the establishment in Willoughby Crescent. Mr. Bayne appeared on the morning after Sylvia's flight, and that abode and its belongings had, as it were, dissolved and vanished before his coming, just as Lamia's air-built palace melted when that serpent woman was denounced by the Corinthian philosopher. Shadrach Bayne paid and dismissed all the servants except Mrs. Stringfold, whom he sent back to Perham with her youthful charge, without enlightening her as to his reasons for so doing. He informed Mr. Carew with extreme politeness that it would be necessary for him to find other quarters forthwith, and at 2:00 in the afternoon he restored the keys of No. 17 Willoughby Crescent to the house agent, with all moneys due to him on account of that dwelling house. Mr. Carew pressed for an explanation, whereupon the steward, in briefest plainest words, told the story of his daughter's wrongdoing. "I decline to believe this statement until it is proved to my satisfaction," said Mr. Carew. "How do I know that this is not a plot of your hatching? It is easy enough for you to assert that the surviving brother is Sir Aubrey, and not Mr. Perham. "There is one piece of evidence which ought to be convincing to you, Mr. Carew," answered the steward, unmoved. "What evidence, sir?" "Your daughter's flight." James Carew was silent. He removed from Willoughby Crescent to a single room in the shabbiest by-street of that aristocratic neighbourhood. Even cities of palaces have their outer fringe of hovels, where wealth's pauper dependents may find shelter. A sad change for Mr. Carew to find himself living in a shabby lodging on his scanty reserve fund, and with faintest hope of future comfort. A brief statement of the main facts concerning Mordred's death had been made by Mrs. Carter the day before she died, in the presence of Edmund Stanton, Mr. Ledlam, and Mr. Bayne, who came to the arbour expressly to obtain this confession. He had no knowledge of that manuscript in which Sylvia's mother had written the entire history of the conspiracy. This document signed and witnessed, Mr. Bayne had allowed Mrs. Carter to expire in peace, while he remained in attendance upon Sir Aubrey at the chief inn at Hatfield, awaiting the time when it would be wise to remove the baronet to Devonshire. Happily there was no one interested in disputing Sir Aubrey's return to life. The heir at law would be no worse off for his resurrection, and there were no proceedings in Chancery to be feared from him. Nor could the question of identity give much trouble. All the old Periam Place servants had been excluded from the rooms which their master inhabited after his supposed death. Mrs. Carter had performed the most menial services rather than suffer even a housemaid to enter those prison-like apartments. Those old servants who had waited on Sir Aubrey for years would not fail to recognize him. There was Mr. Stimpson, too, who with self-abasement must needs confess the cheat that had been put upon him. Altogether there could be little doubt as to Sir Aubrey's reception at Periam Place. One important question remained to be decided. Was the wretched woman who had fled to be pursued by the law? Was any penalty to be exacted from her for her iniquity? Here Mr. Bayne found himself at fault. His master and client was weak in mind and body, certainly in no condition to answer such a question as this. Finding himself obliged to determine on the course to be followed, Mr. Bayne pursued his customary plan in all such difficulties. He referred the matter to his own interests, and decided that he had nothing to gain by hunting the miserable fugitive, or by dragging Sir Aubrey's sufferings and Sir Aubrey's wrongs before a court of law. All the law could do would be to restore Sir Aubrey to the position from which he had been ousted. If Sir Aubrey could be restored without the aid of the law, why incur the expense and scandal of law proceedings? This is how Shadrach Bayne argued. He had tasted all the sweets of revenge, and could afford to be negatively merciful to the woman who had scorned him. Let her go, let her starve, forgotten and unknown in some foreign city, or let her win shameful fortune by the beauty he had once admired. Her fate could signify very little to him. The estate which he had once hoped to win through his influence over her was now removed beyond the limit of his hopes. He had only his stewardship to look to. But Sir Aubrey's helplessness and his son's infancy made the Periam stewardship a very comfortable thing. "I shall be a rich man before I die," thought Shadrach Bayne, "though I may never be called the Squire." Skillful medical treatment and careful nursing wrought a considerable improvement in Sir Aubrey, and by the time he had been a week in Mr. Bayne's charge at the Hatfield Inn, he had become pretty much the man he was at Periam, before the steward left for his second journey to Cannes. His speech and appearance were alike improved. Memory had in a considerable measure returned. He spoke of familiar things, asked for his old servants, was eager to return to Periam, and never failed to recognize Shadrach Bayne. But on one subject he was curiously silent. His wife's name never passed his lips. Mr. Bayne waited another week, by the end of which the patient's improvement was still more marked. He then wrote to the housekeeper at Periam, announcing his return with Mr. Ledlam's patient, no mention of Sir Aubrey's name, and requesting that Mr. Stimpson might be at the place to receive the invalid on the following evening. Periam was looking its fairest in the glow of an autumnal sunset when Sir Aubrey returned to that peaceful abode of his forefathers. Sir Aubrey, whose name had been inscribed on one of the massive oaken coffins in the Periam vault, whose pompous Latin epitaph, with an error in an ablative case, when was there a Latin epitaph without an erroneous termination of substantive or adjective, according to some learned caviller, adorned the chapel wall? Mr. Bayne and his charge drove from the station in the yellow chariot, which had been sent to meet them by the steward's order. Sir Aubrey gazed upon that familiar scene in silent rapture. All the consciousness remaining to that weakened brain was aroused by the sight of home. How often in his joyless, comfortless captivity his thoughts had wandered dimly backward to these scenes, and with how keen an agony had he told himself that he should see them no more. He turned away from the landscape at last, and clung to his steward's arm with a sudden pang of fear. "You won't let them take me away again, will you, Bayne? You've always been a good servant to me. I tell everyone so. You've improved the property as your father did before you, and kept the servants up to the mark, and not wasted money on fanciful repairs. I've always praised you. You won't let me be sent away, will you, Bayne? If I am mad, I am not mad enough to do anyone any harm. And I am Aubrey. They may talk themselves dumb, but they can never shake me from the certainty of that one fact. I know my own name. Mordred is a poor creature. My brother, but a poor creature. I will never submit to be called Mr. Perriam." "Your brother Mordred is in his grave," replied Mr. Bayne, "and you are Sir Aubrey Perriam, sole owner and master of this place. You shall never leave it again, save at your own wish." "Poor Mordred dead! Bless my soul!" murmured Sir Aubrey. "He was a poor creature, but I was fond of him, and he was fond of me. A man's hold on his own life relaxes when he loses his only brother." They were at the house by this time. All the servants were assembled in the hall, according to Mr. Bayne's instructions, and Mr. Stimpson was also in attendance. The outer world was still steeped in sunset's fading glory, but the lamps in the dusky old hall were lighted, and shone full on the faces of the travellers. One startled cry broke from almost every lip as the baronet appeared among his household, leaning on Mr. Bayne's arm, and supported on the other side by a valet whom the steward had engaged for him at Hatfield. "Sir Aubrey Perriam?" "Yes," replied Mr. Bayne, "Sir Aubrey Perriam. I thought such faithful servants would hardly fail to recognize a master they had served so long. Sir Aubrey Perriam, in spite of Lady Perriam's pretended widowhood, in spite of the lying epitaph in Perriam Church, in spite of the funeral, and the will which I read in this house, Sir Aubrey alive, and among you once more. The coffin that was carried out of those doors held the body of Sir Aubrey's brother Mordred. For the last 8 months Sir Aubrey has been the victim of a most foul conspiracy. But I have unearthed the plotters, I have unravelled their mystery. I have brought your old master back again to you, and to his rights and his home." Cheers, long and loud, for Sir Aubrey and his deliverer. Mr. Bayne felt all the sweetness of being a hero. Mr. Stimpson advanced, pale and scared of aspect, and examined the countenance of his old patient. "Good heavens! How could I have been so much mistaken?" he exclaimed. "Yes, it is indeed Sir Aubrey. Those artful women! They kept the room dark and contrived to distract my attention. There ought to have been an inquest. Sir Aubrey, can you ever forgive me?" "I forgive everybody," said the baronet feebly, looking round with an agitated expression. "And now I think I should like to go to bed, Bayne. You'll stop with me, won't you? You'll take care. You'll not let them remove me while I'm asleep." "Sir Aubrey, you are beneath your own roof. You are sole master here. This house holds no secret enemy now. You can sleep in safety. You are surrounded by faithful servants." The old man looked at them with a faint smile. "I thank them kindly for remembering me," he said, and then looking about him as if he suddenly remembered something. "I should like to see my son," he exclaimed. Mrs. Stringfold came with her youthful charge, the youthful charge somewhat cross and sleepy, having been kept awake against his will for the last hour in case Sir Aubrey should ask to see him. The old man looked down at him tenderly. There was no imbecility in that fond gaze, but sentient affection, a father's deep and silent love. "I shall sleep better now that I have seen my boy," he said, "now that I know we two are under the same roof. Never let anybody part us again. 67. Since there's no help, come, let us kiss and part. Edmund Stanton went back to his hotel after that last journey from Hatfield, and made all arrangements for starting by the Continental train next morning. He was going to Paris, and thence on to Marseilles, and possibly to Algiers. He went to seek forgetfulness among strange scenes and a strange people, where not a feature of the landscape, not a word spoken near him, would recall the English home from which he was self-banished, or the hopes he had lost. He went into the reading-room after dinner, and turned over the day's newspapers, with but the faintest interest in anything he read in them, when something happened which changed all his plans, and put that thought of a winter in Algiers out of his head for the present. The following brief advertisement appeared among various enigmatic appeals in the second column of the Times supplement, not the day's paper, but a 2 days old supplement, as Edmund discovered afterwards when he looked at the date. The friends of a lady now lying seriously ill at the Pier Hotel, New Haven, are requested to communicate with the proprietress. The lady arrived by the afternoon train from Lewes on Thursday, September 10th, and has been suffering from fever and delirium ever since. Her linen is marked S.P. She wears a large diamond cross, and has in her possession a morocco handbag with patent lock supposed to contain valuables. There could be no doubt as to the person indicated. It was 7:30 when Edmund Stanton read the advertisement. He was at the London Bridge Station at 8, and at 7:15 was on his way to New Haven. He had to wait upwards of an hour at Lewes, and it was 11 by the time he reached the end of his journey. Here he encountered only disappointment, and perplexity awaited him. The landlady had a strange story to tell him. She had sent the advertisement to the Times on the preceding Friday, by the advice of the medical man who saw the possibility of the patient's fever developing into typhus or typhoid. The landlady had been terrified by the mere suggestion of such a thing, and was for removing the patient at once to the county hospital. This the doctor had pronounced impossible. She was too ill to bear such a journey, and the most that could be done would be to remove her to some adjacent lodging, there to await communications from friends who might see the Times advertisement. This was done immediately, and it happened, curiously, that from the hour of removal the sufferer began to mend. She was calmer, and the fever considerably reduced by Saturday night. On Sunday she was able to leave her bed. The next day the improvement was still more marked. The patient was calm and sensible, opened her bag and produced a purse, from which she gave the doctor a £20 note for the landlady of the hotel, and a £10 note on account of his own services. On Monday evening the nurse who had charge of the patient ventured to leave her for a little while, in order to go into the village upon some errand. According to this woman's statement, she was only absent 1/4 of an hour, but on her return the patient was gone. The nurse had left her dressed and lying on the sofa. Search was immediately made, but vainly. The time of the patient's disappearance was within a few minutes of the time at which the boat started for Dieppe, but nobody had thought of going to the pier, or suggested the idea of the patient having gone on board the steamer till too late. When the same steamer returned to New Haven, it was ascertained that a lady dressed in black, answering the description of the nameless fever patient, had crossed on the last voyage to Dieppe. No one had remarked where she went, or whether she was met by anyone on the arrival of the steamer. "I'm afraid the poor dear young lady must be a little queer in her head," said the landlady with a sympathetic air. That £20 note had paid her very well for the beef teas and arrowroots made for the invalid. "Dr. Folcott says that she must have endangered her life by that foolish journey, for, though she seemed to get round so quickly, she was as weak as a baby, and only keeping herself up by some inward excitement. She was just in the state for a relapse." "There is no boat till to-morrow, I suppose?" said Mr. Stanton. "No, sir, not till to-morrow morning at 10. "Then I shall cross by that boat. Dieppe is not a large place. It will go hard with me if I do not find this lady." If the landlady expected some enlightenment as to the circumstances of her nameless guest, she was doomed to disappointment. Mr. Stanton thanked her for her care of the helpless traveller, but told her nothing. He called on the local surgeon next morning, and heard his opinion of the case. It was not cheering. Edmund Stanton was in Dieppe before dark that evening, going quietly from place to place, inquiring for the fugitive. After 2 hours' diligent search, he found her at a third-rate hotel in the town, a small room on the 4th story, paved with red tiles. She was lying on a narrow bed in a low alcove, with a Sister of Mercy sitting on a rush-bottomed chair by the bedside, counting her beads, and whispering prayers, while the patient lay in a slumber that seemed more restless than the most unquiet wakefulness. Sylvia had struggled hard to go on she knew not whither, to Paris or anywhere, but had broken down at the Dieppe railway station, where she found herself hardly able to stand. She tottered to the waiting room, and here was seen by the good Sister of Mercy, who, finding her helpless and friendless, took her in charge, put her into a hackney carriage, and had her conveyed to the hotel where she was now lying. Before nightfall the fever was again at its height, and the dreaded typhoid speedily declared itself. The Dieppe doctor ordered cooling drinks, bled the patient 2 or 3 times, exercised all his skill for the one great end of reducing the system. In this he had succeeded to admiration, and the patient, thus robbed of forces which might have fought the disease, had succumbed to the fever. One look at that wasted face, those glassy eyes which opened and looked at him without recognition, told Edmund Stanton that the end was inevitable. How near or how distant that end might be he knew not. He telegraphed to London for the famous Dr. Crow, reckless of the sacrifice of the doctor's time and his own money, feeling very sure that it was too late for any good to be done by the wisest physician upon earth, but anxious to do the uttermost for this wreck of humanity which had once been his idol. The great doctor telegraphed a prompt reply. It was impossible for him to come to Dieppe, but he would send Dr. Daw, a star of secondary magnitude in the medical world. For Dr. Daw's arrival Mr. Stanton waited patiently, but not hopefully. He shared the Sister's watch beside that sick bed, his hand held the cup of cooling drink to those parched lips, heedless of what poison might lurk in the burning breath that seemed almost to sear his face as he bent over the sufferer. How changed she was! That lovely Sylvia, whose beauty had been so fatal a gift. The red gold hair had been shorn close to the small head by the nurse's scissors, the once oval cheek was now hollowed and cavernous, the jaw square and bony, and those eyes, lamps of splendour, were now dull and lightless. Could there be keener agony than to mark such decay, and to remember how he had loved her, and to feel that he loved her still, that she was dear to him in her misery, dear to him despite her guilt? Once during the long hours of his watch the sufferer awaked suddenly from a sleep that had been somewhat quieter than that restless doze in which she was wont to lie. The dark eyes were slowly turned towards him, and gazed at him with the gradual dawn of recognition. The words that followed denoted that, although Sylvia knew her lover, she had no consciousness of late events or the place where she was. "I thought you wouldn't leave me, Edmund, just before our wedding," she said in her feeble, tremulous voice. "But you've been away so long, and I have been lying here with that dark woman watching me, that woman over there in the black gown. Why don't you send her away? You know I detest black. I wore mourning so long for Sir Aubrey, but that is all over now, and my wedding dress is ready. I showed it to you, didn't I, Edmund? Such lovely point lace, fit for a duchess, but not too good for your wife. I want to look my best that day. What have they done with my hair?" she cried, passing her thin fingers over her head with a weak, uncertain movement. "They haven't cut it off, have they? They couldn't be so cruel as that. I was always praised for my hair, though some of the Hedingham girls called it red. Is it all gone? Am I in prison, Edmund, for some dreadful crime? Could they put me in prison for that?" There were fitful pauses between these broken sentences, and many of the words were imperfect and indistinct. Only the keen ear of affection could have intercepted those rambling utterances of half-consciousness. Edmund soothed and comforted the sufferer, murmured words of hope, spoke of another world, that world whose mystic gates stood ajar. Vain effort, the shallow worldly mind was still given to earthly things, had neither care nor hope beyond earth. "Is to-day our wedding day, Edmund?" she asked. "Don't deceive me. I am not too ill to go to the church. Let me get up and be dressed."
Where is Celine? Send that dark woman away, and bring me Celine. I know my wedding dress has come home. Why do you turn from me like that, Edmund, and hide your face in your hands? There is no one who can prevent our marriage. Sir Aubrey is safe."
Then followed long intervals of silence, and then wandering words that had no meaning, even for Edmund's attentive ear. He watched beside that bed day and night, while the patient Sister of Mercy sat in a corner behind the bed curtain, where Sylvia could not see her, and prepared the medicines and fever drinks, and directed Mr. Standon's ministrations, and prayed with all the fervor of her simple soul for the fading sinner. Dr. Daw came, but could do nothing except pronounce that the Dieppe surgeon had been altogether at fault, and prescribe a new mode of treatment, which, had it been adopted earlier, might have saved the patient, but which could now only prolong life, and lengthen the weariness of dying. The life thus protracted, watched with unremitting care, lasted 3 or 4 days after Dr. Daw's visit, and then, in the quiet midnight, the tired sufferer slipped almost unawares into the undiscovered country. Love watched the last breath; religion knelt by the bed; and thus the worldly soul went forth from the region of human pity and affection into the awful solitude beyond, whither no human imagination dared follow it. Once, very near the end, there came a gleam of light. The lips, which had been voiceless for many long hours, moved faintly, and Edmund, leaning down to catch the feeble whisper, heard Sylvia's last words: "Kiss me once again before I go, as you kissed me in the churchyard, before I betrayed you." Living and dying lips met in the last kiss of a love that had been fatal. End of chapters 66 and 67. Chapters 68 through 70 of Taken at the Flood by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 68. Love is enough. Sylvia Perriam had been laid in her foreign grave, and Edmund Standon had gone on to Marseilles before he began to feel that he would have to pay the penalty of his devotion to the dying sinner. On the day of his arrival at the southern seaport, the grip of the fever fiend fastened on him, limbs aching, head burning, fits of heat and cold, aguish shiverings. He sent for the best English doctor in Marseilles, and told him what he had been doing, and that he was in for a fever. The doctor tried to make light of these apprehensions, yet confessed that Marseilles was not the safest place a man who had the fever poison in his system could come to. "Is there anyone you would like me to write to in the event of your getting worse?" he asked kindly. "I don't apprehend such a thing, but it's always wise to be equal to either fortune, as Shakespeare puts it." "You are very good. Yes, if the worst should come, I don't wish to die quite alone in a strange country. I'll give you my mother's address. When you see danger, telegraph to her, but on no account before there is danger. She is no traveler, and the journey to Marseilles will be a formidable one for her." The doctor promised to obey. Before the week was ended, he saw sufficient peril to justify his sending the telegram to Dean House. A carefully worded telegram, cautioning Mrs. Standon against any undue fear. "I have not waited for the worst," said the message, "but obey your son, who told me to summon you directly the case appeared serious. The case is serious, but by no means desperate. Come, and do not fear." Within an hour of her receipt of that message Mrs. Standon was on her way to London, not alone. A faithful friend and companion accompanied her, and sustained her with words of hope, earnest words breathed from a heart that faith had armed against calamity. Edmund's struggle for life was severe and protracted. His awaking from the long night of delirium was sweet, for in the nurse who watched beside his pillow he recognized the mother whose kind face had bent over his cot years ago in the Dean House nursery. "I have known you all the time, mother." That was his first rational sentence. And indeed there had run through the tangled skein of his delirious dreams that one familiar thread, bright and clear through all. He had known that his mother watched him. He had known the hand that gave him his medicines, that administered the food he loathed, with tender insistence. "But there was someone else, wasn't there, mother?" he asked, before that first day of convalescence was over. "I seem to have had 2 nurses." "You have been carefully nursed, Edmund," replied Mrs. Stanton evasively. "I am sure of that. But who was the other nurse? A Sister of Mercy, perhaps?" "Yes, Edmund, a Sister of Mercy." "Has she gone away?" "Yes, she left last night." "Curious. I should like to have seen her face, now that I have recovered my wits, and to have thanked her." "I have thanked her for you, Edmund. Well, I suppose that will do. I have you with me, mother. That is enough. Do you remember that letter in which you told me that you had done with me, that I was no longer your son? Never speak of that dreadful time, Edmund. You see what a mother's anger means. In your hour of danger she is by your side. Oh, my dear son, I thank God that your heart was not quite turned from me. You told the doctor to send for me. You could not die without forgiving me." "Forgiving you, mother? Am not I the offender?" "No, Edmund, no. I had no right to be so angry with you. There should be no limit to a mother's forbearance. But I tried your patience too much by my folly. It is all over now," with a sigh. "I shall never need your forbearance again in that way." 2 or 3 days after, when the invalid was able to sit up in bed, propped by pillows, Mrs. Stanton and her son began to talk of the future. It was Edmund who started the subject. The mother would have feared to touch upon any question that might pain her son, newly snatched from the jaws of death. "Shall you want me to go back to Dean House yet awhile, mother?" he asked dutifully. "I mean to obey you in all things henceforward. I have no one else to live for, no one else to think of. You are all the world to me again, the one perfect woman in the world, as you used to be when I was a boy. Would you like to go back, Edmund?" He shuddered at the question. "Honestly, no, mother. The old scenes would be hateful. But I don't want to be separated from you, and it seems a hard thing to ask such a home loving mother as you to join my wanderings." "I can have no home without you, Edmund. I am ready to go with you wherever you like. I am a sturdy old woman, you know, and shall not give you much trouble with ill health, or vapors, or anything of that kind. And little as I have traveled, I don't think I shall make a very bad traveler, if I can only get accustomed to the sea," added Mrs. Stanton with a wry face. "You dear lion hearted mother. I will take care that our wanderings are made easy for you. I did think of wintering in Algiers, a splendid climate, interesting scenery." Mrs. Stanton shivered involuntarily. "But if you will be my companion, I'll abandon all idea of Africa." Mrs. Stanton breathed more freely. Africa to her mind meant wastes of torrid sand, and grim yelping blackamoors dancing round the helpless traveler, a circle of ferocious murderers. "What would you say to our wintering in Rome or Florence?" Mrs. Stanton brightened visibly, and kissed her son's wasted hand. "I think I should like Florence best, dear," she said. "I've heard there are plenty of nice English people there." "Yes," answered Edmund. "And when English people travel, their chief delight seems to be to meet with other English people. They would like the continent extremely well if they could exterminate the natives and convert the more agreeable half of Europe into one large Brighton." Edmund's convalescence was rapid, a fact which the doctor attributed to Mrs. Stanton's nursing even more than to his own skill. As soon as he was strong enough to bear the journey, mother and son went on to Nice. Thence, after a fortnight's sojourn, to Geneva, and thence late in November to Florence. That tranquil close of the declining year was a time of sorrowful thoughts for Edmund, but not of despair. All his boyish love for his mother came back to him in their reunion. He was pleased with her delight in the scenes they beheld together; pleased by her keen interest in simple things, and all those glimpses of village life and unsophisticated nature which their travels afforded them. Neither spoke of the past, or speculated upon the future. For the mother, the sweetness of the present was all sufficient. She had her son once more hers, and hers only, and she was content to leave the future to Providence. "I will never try to rule his life again," she thought. "I was too anxious that he should marry Esther, and see what came of it. Misery for both of them. It is enough for me to have him for my own once again, and to be sure of his affection. The happiness I desire for him will come sooner or later." 69. 5 years later. 5 years are gone since Edmund Stanton and his mother wintered in Florence, and Sir Aubrey still reigns at Perriam, no longer the helpless paralytic old man who could only creep about between the sustaining arms of nurse and valet, but a hale old gentleman who rides a quiet cob, Vice the spirited Splinter, round the home farm 3 or 4 days a week, while his chubby 6-year-old son accompanies him on a fat Exmoor pony. This wonderful restoration is more or less Shadrach Bain's achievement. It was Mr. Bain who heard of the mud baths in Germany, Mr. Bain who accompanied Sir Aubrey to the place of those baths, Mr. Bain who was the moving spirit of Sir Aubrey's cure. German physicians, German mud, and German water were but secondary agents. Mr. Bain's energy was the motive power that set the machinery going. Some trace of the old weakness on the left side still remains, but, despite of this, in mind and body the baronet has become a new man. It is just possible that his delight in watching his son's growth from infancy to childhood, his deep pride in the thought that a son of his will inherit Perriam, and maintain the good old Tory traditions of the place, may have helped German doctors to work their cure. Perhaps Sir Aubrey Perriam, in this Indian summer of his age, enjoys as near an approach to perfect happiness as heaven ever grants to humanity. One bitter memory hangs like a distant thundercloud above the horizon of his life, but he is wise enough to shut his eyes to that cloud for the most part, and it is not often the dark hour comes upon him. That gloomy hour when those who know him best know that he is thinking of his wicked wife. His boy is the pride and pleasure of his days. Already he has engaged a tutor, an Oxford master of arts, to train that tender plant so that its earliest shoots may be wisely directed. He cannot endure the thought of public schools and football matches, and it is to be feared that the youthful St. John, brought up at Perriam Place in the care of a private tutor, will be deficient in that athleticism which is the one virtue modern society copies from the Spartans. The father watches his boy with almost maternal tenderness, and is miserable on those winter mornings when St. John trots away on his Exmoor pony to see the hounds throw off, under his tutor's wing. The tutor is anxious the boy should be manly, and the father approves the tutor's desire, yet would fain guard his treasure as carefully as a miser cherishes an unset diamond, a gem of liquid light which may slip through his fingers unawares while he gloats over his treasure. The county has never quite understood how the brother who was supposed to be dead has come to life again. It is one of those dark pages of family history which must forever remain mysterious. But the county has not the slightest doubt as to the one fact that this is the real Sir Aubrey. Happily the baronet has grown almost his old self since the renovating process of the German baths. He dresses as carefully as of old, and but for an elderly stoop in the shoulders, looks almost as young a man as the Sir Aubrey who honoured the Headingham school feast with his illustrious presence 7 years ago. Mr. Bain basks in the sunlight of his master's favour, and grows more prosperous every year, always winding his way deeper and wider into the soil of Monkhampton, till half the houses in that prosperous town own Shadrach Bain as ground landlord. His elder daughters have married well. His sons are an honour to him. Dawker serves his father with zeal that knows not weariness, and the younger grammar school boys bring home handsomely bound volumes as prizes, such novelties in literature as the poetic works of Milton, Cooper, and Thomson, to adorn the rosewood loo table in the family drawing-room. Altogether, Mr. Bain is a man who seems to have profited more than his fellows by the blindness of fortune. Yet sometimes, even in the midst of his prosperity, he thinks with a regretful sigh of that lordly pleasure-house which he once built for his soul, that airy edifice of his daydreams, which he had hoped to see realized in substantial brick and mortar. He remembers how near he had seemed to victory, and how utterly he failed; how his wisdom had been but foolishness beside a woman's cunning. "Things turned out well for me, however, after all," he reflects, after that survey of the one failure that has disfigured his successful life, a failure only known to himself and the dead. "I am in a better position than I ever was in before with Sir Aubrey. My income increases every year. I don't see how any man can ask more than that from Providence. And if I cared to buy myself an estate and called myself squire, I am rich enough to do it." 70. The Purple Light of Love. while poor Sir Aubrey Perriam's existence drifts by in repose almost as tranquil as that of the lotus eaters on their sunlit isle, life has serious duties and responsibilities for Mr. Stanton, Conservative member for Monkhampton, a rising young politician of the new school. Edmund Stanton has not returned to the bank. At his mother's request he has abandoned that commercial career which served to occupy a mind too active to endure idleness. He has found another and a higher vocation in the House of Commons, where he comes out sharply upon financial questions, and perplexes honorable gentlemen whose weak side is arithmetic, by searching questions and rapid calculations. He is great on taxation, and is ever ready to assert the wrongs of those shorn lambs of the legislature, those helpless sufferers from the burden of the income tax, whose greatest misfortune is to have 500,000 or so amenable to assessment. Mr. Stanton has a small house in one of the nice old-fashioned streets near Berkeley Square, where his wife is at home every Thursday evening to some of the pleasantest and cleverest people in London, and where Mr. Stanton and 2 or 3 chosen friends sometimes seek relief after a dull evening in the house, at a bright little supper table in the cosy dining-room, and discuss the blunders and general idiocy of friends and foes over a lobster salad and a bottle of Madeira. Yes, Edmund is happy. That union of which Mrs. Stanton dreamed years ago, when her son was a schoolboy, has come to pass after all, and Edmund is as completely devoted to his true wife Esther as if the fatal attachment which overshadowed his youth were no more than the memory of a dream. 2 years of foreign travel, and much hard study in the tranquil pauses of his wanderings, served to lay the ghost of that buried love. He came back to England heart-free, and brought with him a treatise on finance, which has won him some renown as a political economist, and helped him to acquire a position in the House of Commons. During those 2 years of exile, Edmund and Esther never met. Miss Rochdale remained at Dean House, the ruling spirit of order in that model household, quietly doing her duty, visiting the sick, feeding the poor, educating Mrs. Sargent's children who adore her, joining in the small festivities of the neighborhood, and uttering no complaint against a life which must have been somewhat joyless and monotonous. Throughout that period of absence Edmund had rarely heard the name of Esther, so carefully did his mother avoid any allusion to her adopted daughter. Only when he ventured to inquire if Miss Rochdale were well and happy was the name spoken that had once been so familiar. On his first visit to Dean House, after his return from the Continent, Mr. Stanton looked around for Esther and missed her. He was told that she had gone to Wexmouth with the children, Mrs. Sargent having been afraid the sea air would be too strong for her. "The sea air always gives me my nervous headache, you know, Edmund," said Ellen apologetically. "So dear Essie was kind enough to take the children." "She was always kind," replied Edmund moodily. It vexed him to think that Esther had run away in order to avoid meeting him. That visit to Exmouth could only have been a pretext. 1 week in September would do as well as another for the children's seaside trip, and why choose the week of his return, unless she really wished to avoid him? "Have I made myself so detestable to her that she cannot endure the sight of me, even after all I have suffered?" thought Mr. Stanton. "She used to be so full of pity, especially for wrong doers." There was one question which he wanted to ask Esther, a question that had been in his mind more or less ever since his illness at Marseilles, a question which he could only ask when they two were face to face. The thought of this question worried him a good deal during the first day or two at Dean House. It took such a hold upon his mind that after 3 days of that tranquil home life, after having admired all Miss Rochdale's small improvements in poultry yard, dairy and greenhouses, the new fernery at the end of the shrubbery, and a dozen other evidences of taste and industry which testified to the care of the gentle home goddess, Edmund's patience would endure no longer, and he startled his mother on the 4th morning by announcing that he was going to Exmouth to see Esther and the children. "Those scraps of humanity must have grown out of all knowledge in the last 2 years," he said, artfully insinuating thereby that his chief anxiety was to see his small nephew and nieces. "Georgie is growing a fine boy, Edmund," said his sister proudly, "and so like his dear papa. He has the Sargent nose." "A fine, prominent beak. Looks as if it was made on purpose for a barrister's wig," replied Mr. Stanton irreverently. He was off to Exmouth by a little branch line from Monkhampton before noon, and arrived at that tranquil and retired watering place at 1 o'clock. Wexmouth is not extensive, and instead of going to Miss Rochdale's lodging on Lighthouse Hill, Edmund strolled along the beach, taking his chance of finding her among the idlers who were scattered in groups here and there upon the strip of alternate sand and shingle between the blue water and the sea wall. The tide was out, and the juvenile patrons of Wexmouth were having a good time with their pails and spades. No one would stay indoors on such a day as this, Edmund thought. The sky one cloudless blue, the sea a sunlit lake. He went on to the utmost limits of Wexmouth, feeling very sure that he should find Esther by and by. Yes, there she was, a lonely little figure seated in the shadow of an old fishing boat, reading. He knew her ever so far away. The small, graceful form, the pure white dress, the dark, soft hair under the little sailor hat, the Esther of old times, the Esther he had once so narrowly escaped loving with all his heart. Too late to love her now. Gentle and unselfish as she was, he could hardly ask her to accept a love which would seem at best remorse. The children were paddling and splashing and making themselves gritty at the edge of the water some distance from Esther. Instead of rushing straight to these small people to see if they had verily grown out of knowledge, and if Georgie really had the sergeant nose, this traitorous uncle never so much as looked at those amphibious revellers, but walked on to the boat and quietly seated himself about half a yard from Esther. She did not even look up from her book. The shelter of the boat was public property. Yet it was uncomfortable to have a stranger seated so near her, and in a few minutes Esther rose to join the children, whose sports were becoming more and more watery. A hand gently detained her. The stranger had risen too, and had laid his hand upon her arm. "Esther, why are you so determined to run away from me?" he asked quietly. She turned and confronted her false lover, very pale. There was no anger in the sweet face, only a look of shocked surprise. "Sit down again, Esther, and let us talk quietly for a few minutes. Friend, sister, will you refuse me so small a favor?" That appeal touched her. She obeyed him without a word, and they seated themselves side by side under the shadow of the boat. Edmund was slow to speak, so slow that the silence became a little awkward, and Esther felt herself obliged to say something. "What brought you to Wexmouth, Edmund?" she asked carelessly. "I hope Ellen isn't anxious about the children." "Ellen knows the children are safer in your keeping than in hers, Essie." The old pet name fluttered that steadfast heart a little. "I came here on my own account. Do you know that for the last 2 years I have been tormenting myself with one particular question?" "Indeed? It ought to be a very important question." "It is to me a question of life or death. When I was ill at Marseilles, Esther, I had 2 nurses. My mother was one. I knew her even at the worst. But the other, I used to fancy that her presence was but a dream. It was not a dream, was it, Essie? There was a second nurse who watched me night and day and wept many tears for my sake. Who was that faithful nurse, Esther? I want you to tell me. Dare I believe that the one noble-hearted woman I had most deeply wronged came to me, out of the benevolence of her heart, in my time of danger?" "Not out of benevolence, Edmund," said Esther. "It could not have been for love of me she came." "Oh, Esther!" cried Edmund Stanton, seizing the girl's 2 hands, drawing her towards him, looking at her with eyes that shone with love and hope. "If you can but say that it was, you will make me happier than I ever dreamed I could be. Love, my love, truly loved at last, tell me that I have not outworn your patience, not quite exhausted your regard." Tears were his only answer. An all-sufficient answer, it would seem. For in the silver moonlight of that September evening 2 happy lovers walked upon Wexmouth's shingly shore and talked of the future. The future came, and did not belie their hopes. When autumn's first glory gilds the woods, sober old Dean House wakes up to a new life, with the arrival of Mr. and Mrs. Stanton, their babies and nurses, their friends and followers. The old monotony of that orderly household is pleasantly broken, and the dowager Mrs. Stanton finds life full of new interests. She is proud of her son's success as a public man, and amongst the choicest treasures in her sandalwood desk cherishes the report of his speeches, which Esther has cut out of the Times to send to "Grandmamma." Ellen Sargent looks on placidly at her brother's happiness, while Georgie and the two girls pet and patronize their baby cousins, and only murmurs now and then with a gentle sigh, "What an interest poor dear George would have felt in Edmund's parliamentary career." Thus the peaceful domestic life flows on, happy and not unuseful, not that empty unprofitable life which Goethe has called worse than an early death. End of chapters 68 through 70. The end of Taken at the Flood, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Recorded by Celine Major.